Lord, we praise you. We thank you for the freedom that we have to gather here today, and I pray that your Spirit will guide us into understanding, not only understanding of what the text means, God, but we do pray for that, but also understanding of how to apply it in our lives, God. And not only of how to apply it, God, but understanding of how to have the motivation and the willpower to actually go and apply it. Because, Lord, knowing how to apply things is not enough. We need to actually be devoted enough to you to be willing to go out and do it, Lord. So as we're here right now, God, I pray that you will give us faith to be strong and strength to be faithful. Help us give you the glory that you deserve. And may we be transformed by the reading of your word tonight. In your name we pray. Amen. Today we are in 2 Kings chapter 4. And this is a pretty exciting chapter of 2 Kings. There's a lot of stuff that goes on here. Last week was... I hope it was exciting for you. Every week I'm trying to find different ways to make the story somewhat exciting because we are in 2 Kings, which many people would consider one of the probably hardest books to do a Bible study through just because it can be very confusing and in many ways kind of dry in some places. But I'm trying to find different ways to liven it up. So last week the running thing was that it was almost a mystery story. Right, to where you read the first 26 verses and you think you know what's happening, and then the 27th verse changes everything, and you're like, oh, I gotta go read it all over again. But this week, it actually is not that hard to make it exciting, because it is an action-packed chapter. I have called this the Miracles of Elisha, and if you've been tracking with the Bible so far, you'll actually realize that there aren't a lot of, miracle workers in the story of Scripture. Right? I mean, there's Moses, there's Elijah, there's Elisha, and then there's really Jesus and the apostles, right? But by and large, I mean, there might be, there's miraculous things that happen all the time because God is at work in the world. But by and large, I mean, there's not a bunch of different people who are just known for regularly going about doing really cool, miraculous stuff in the Bible, right? We kind of think of it like that, but that's because stories like this stick out to us. And so this is the longest chapter that we've gone through, I think, so far in 2 Kings. I think just because there's 44 verses here. But unfortunately, we're not going to be able to go as in depth because there's just a lot to cover. But to get us started, I will remind us that the context is that we are in the divided kingdom of Israel. About 100 years before the events that we're currently talking about, the kingdom of Israel split in two. The southern kingdom is the kingdom of Judah. The northern kingdom is the kingdom of Israel. And for the time being, we've actually departed Judah, and we've been actually tracking with the northern kingdom of Israel for a while. Every now and then, Judah will interact with them, and we've been seeing some of the kings there. And we will return to Judah a while down the road. But right now, the author of Kings is focusing us on the northern kingdom of Israel, specifically on the ministries of two people. This guy named Elijah and his protege and successor named Elisha. Right? Elijah, he left in 2 Kings chapter 2. The way he left, I do not mean that he died. He actually did not die. One of two people in the Bible who did not. He was taken up in a whirlwind by a chariot of fire to heaven. Really cool story. We talked about that 2 weeks ago. And then in chapter 3, we got to see Elisha continuing on serving the Lord, even in Elijah's absence. But the chapter kind of shifted focus, and it focused more on the politics going on at this time period. And we got to see some people rebel against the northern kingdom, and we got to see how the northern kingdom responded, and then we got to see Elisha show up in there and kind of interact with the story. But by and large, that was a kind of contained story that really resolved stuff that goes way back to chapter 1, right? Once we get to chapter 4, really this is almost just like a montage of the ministry of Elisha. And that's going to be this week's chapter and next week's chapter and a little bit into chapter 6 and stuff like that. We're going to be with Elisha for a while. But this chapter is where you just get a whole bunch of really cool stories that both look backwards into the Old Testament and backwards to Elijah, and they also look forward to this guy named Jesus, who you might have possibly heard about at some point in your life. So just to get us started here, before we actually dive into the text, I want to read from our handy-dandy commentary. I'm going to be referencing this every now and then. But one thing that I did want to highlight is the contrast between the characters of Elijah and Elisha. Because as we're going through this text, there's going to be a lot of miracles that Elisha does that are going to sound very similar to things that Elijah did. And I think the author of this commentary does a good job of kind of just highlighting how those similarities and differences actually teach us something about the characters and what is going on at that time period, right? So I'm going to read a little bit of an extended portion of this real quick, but I think it'll be worth it so that once we get into the text, we can go through it a bit quicker, right? Just because it puts it in a much more condensed manner. All right, so Elisha comes as a life giver to an Israel bereft of its husband, and in a number of ways, his ministry continues Elijah's. Like his master, he helps a widow in desperate circumstances and raises a child from the dead. In several respects, Elisha's miracles are reminiscent of the incident on Mount Carmel, and in 2 Kings, Elisha assists a Gentile citizen of an enemy nation as Elijah assists the widow of Zarephath, right? If you remember those going back to 1 Kings. But Elisha's ministry is not simply a repetition of Elijah's. Elijah is the lone Moses confronting the Pharaoh-like Ahab without even an Aaron to assist him. What Elijah does singly, Elisha does in a community or with the archetypal bumbling sidekick, Gehazi. Elijah's ministry focuses on calling Ahab to repentance, but once the fate of Ahab's house is sealed, Elisha concentrates on building a living community of faith within Israel, a living community within the corpse of Omri, Israel. Omri, remember, is Ahab's father. When Elisha speaks to the kings of Israel, he normally brings good news. Elijah conducted himself, much of his ministry, through the dramatic public confrontations with Ahab and Baal. Elisha works largely behind closed doors, right? And so, right there, you're just highlighting some of the basic similarities and differences, right? So a lot of the miracles are very similar. They're doing similar things to similar people, but also Elisha is very, very different, right? But then this is actually the thing that I find most interesting, and I think that this is where it's going to be relevant to our discussion today. The difference is symbolized geographically, right? Through the map itself, we see the difference. Elijah spends much of his life on the far side of the Jordan River, at the Wadi Kerith and Zarephath, then at Sinai, and again when he is taken to heaven. As noted above, and this is going way back to 1 Kings 17, his absence is theologically important, a sign that Yahweh sends the word of Yahweh into exile with the prophet and derives from the people of his word. Right? Hey, what's up, man? And so what he's highlighting there is that Elijah, a lot of his ministry is actually outside of the borders of mainline Israel. Right? There's some stuff that he does in the borders, but most of it is across the Jordan River, or over at Sinai, or over at Zarephath. By contrast, Elisha spends most of his ministry in the land. He is apparently traveling with the king during the Moabite War, which we read about last chapter, and also is in Damascus to consult with Hazazel in chapter 8. But otherwise, his miracles are all done within the boundaries of Israel. Even when he performs a miracle for a Gentile, Naaman, which we're going to read about next week, he does it from Israel using the Israelite river rather than the rivers of Damascus. Elijah is only briefly in Jezreel, but Elisha is in Samaria to meet Naaman, and during the Aramean siege. The difference is dramatically evident whenever we consider similar miracles, and this is where we're going to come to the stuff today because the miracles are very similar. Elijah multiplies food for a widow in Zarephath, but Elisha multiplies oil for a widow of the sons of the prophets and bread for the gathering of the prophets. Right? So Elijah was outside of the land ministering to Gentiles, whereas Elisha is going to perform similar miracles for Israelite citizens. Elijah raised a Gentile widow's child. Elisha, the miracle child of a Shunammite woman, so an Israelite. Elijah announced the judgment to come and enacts the judgment in his frequent departures from the land, with the doom of the house of Ahab echoing all around him. Elisha, by contrast, nurtures the seed of a renewed Israel within Israel. Right? So we do see this progression here. Right? Elijah is much more the doomsday prophet. Right? So he is always leaving the land as judgment against the people. Right? And he's constantly warning them and saying, come to repentance. But the thing is, they don't really repent. Right? And when they do repent, it's very short-lived. And so, by the time of Elijah's ministry, like Elijah's departure in and of itself is judgment from God. He says, you have rejected my prophet, I'm taking him from you. Right? But all because they have rejected the prophet doesn't mean God's going to give up on Israel. Right? He is going to be faithful to Israel, but he's going to do things differently. And so rather than trying to reform all of Israel, what God's going to do is he is going to try to plant, metaphorically, a new Israel within Israel. Right? And this is something that we see throughout the Bible. Right? It's almost like Israel has enslaved itself. They have become a new Egypt, and therefore God is going to send a new Moses into the land to free them from themselves. And so that, in many ways, is what Elisha is coming to do. Right? So he is going into the land and he is planting little pockets of heaven everywhere he goes, right? And his goal doesn't seem to be to revive the whole nation. It is to bring pockets of it to repentance and just basically plant little pockets of heaven everywhere he goes. And in many ways, that's also where you see the Elijah and Elisha parallel to John the Baptist and Jesus, right? Because John the Baptist, he is the guy who shows up with fire in his eyes, and he is like wagging fingers at kings, calling for repentance. Whereas Jesus, he shows up and he does the same thing. He is forming a new Israel within Israel, right? And within the borders of Israel, Jesus begins to form his church, right? And so Elisha, in many ways, is going to foreshadow Jesus, which we're going to see in this chapter, right? And so I just want you to have that in the back of your mind, so that whenever you're reading these miracles, the thing I want us to focus on is not simply what is happening. I want us to focus specifically on why is this story so similar to the story back then, right? Because that's why they're being shared, right? For all we know, Elisha performed way more miracles than what's recorded in Scripture, right? But these ones have been recorded because they echo something of the past, or they foreshadow something of the future, and they communicate something about what's going on in the land, right? Does that make sense? Right, because this is the book of Kings. It's not simply the book of cool stories about miracles, right? And so ultimately, everything we see here is communicating something political in the end. Sound good? All right. Sean, take it away. First 7 verses.
Now a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets cried out to Elisha, "Your servant my husband is dead, and you know that your servant feared Yahweh. And the creditor has come to take my 2 children to be his slaves." And Elisha said to her, "What shall I do for you? Tell me, what do you have in the house?" And she said, "Your servant woman has nothing in the house except a jar of oil." Then he said, "Go, ask for vessels for yourself from those outside, from all your neighbors, even empty vessels. Do not get a few. And you shall go in and shut the door behind you and your sons, and pour out into all these vessels, and you shall set aside what is full." So she went from him, and shut the door behind her and her sons. They were bringing the vessels to her, and she poured. Now it happened that when the vessels were full, she said to her son, "Bring me another vessel." And he said to her, "There is not one vessel more." And the oil stopped. Then she came and told the man of God. And he said, "Go, sell the oil and pay your debt, and you and your sons can live on the rest."
Perfect. There's miracle number 1 of this chapter. We've seen Elisha perform other miracles, but there's number 1 for this chapter. Somebody, real quick, recap what happens. Like I said, we won't be able to go as in depth, but recap what happens for us.
So Elisha goes to visit this woman who I guess he had a prior connection to, or she's just suggesting that because he was a son of the prophet, he was Elisha's servant because he was also a prophet.
Yeah.
And so she's finding a way to pay off her debt to a creditor so that her children won't be taken as slaves. And Elisha basically tells her, "Okay, what do you have in the house?" And she says, "All I have is a jar of oil." I'm guessing it's probably a small jar, not necessarily one you would expect to fill up a bunch of vessels, which I'm guessing in this case are almost akin to barrels nowadays. And so he says, "Go round up all the vessels that you can and bring them here. Start filling them with the jar of oil." And the oil just kept flowing from the jar. It didn't stop until all the vessels were full, and that led them to have enough to be able to pay off their debt and then also live on some as well.
Yep, very good. Yep.
Reading this, the story reminds me of how Jesus turned fed the 5,000.
Mm-hmm. This is not going to be the only miracle that happens in this chapter that will remind you of that. that actually is going to be recurring. There's actually going to be another miracle later on that you're going to read it and be like, that is 100% what the feeding of the 5,000 is calling back to. That's one thing. Like, a lot of times we read the stories of Jesus, and because we're not familiar with the Old Testament, we just think of those as isolated events. Whereas, that's what I love about the Gospel of John. It never just calls them miracles, it calls them signs. Right? Because it's not simply about power, it's about communicating something. And so when Jesus performs a miracle, he's communicating something to his audience. And so many of the miracles that Jesus performed, they're like calling back to what Elijah did, but they're to like an extreme. Right? It's like, he's like, I'm not just multiplying oil. I'm like, I'm feeding 5,000 people. To where, yeah, that's a very good connection there. Anybody else want to say anything before we just go verse by verse?
I'd like to see that in real life. I would have loved to see oil just keep on flowing.
Yeah, it'd be pretty cool to see it.
Just like a Mary Poppins scenario.
Yes, sir.
Another connection.
It's just like
It's
the
kind of like when Moses hit the rock for water. Water just kept pouring out of the rock.
That's what I'm saying. It calls backwards and it looks forward. It's almost like it's the same God working through all these people, right?
Wow, you don't say.
Yeah, same God, new tricks.
There's another one, but I can't remember.
Yeah. For something about it, in many ways, to me, calls back to Jesus, or calls forward to Jesus turning water to wine. It's not quite the same, but just the idea of like pouring it into the vessels and stuff like that.
Filling them up, yeah.
Okay, real quick, just because I can't help, like reading it just reminded me of this. I got to read something else from the commentary. This chapter actually was really good. All the chapters are pretty good. But y'all remember the book of Ruth, right? We went through it in this Bible study a while back, but it's set during the time period of the Judges. And you remember how basically the whole situation there is that Ruth had a mother-in-law named Naomi.
Yes.
And basically Naomi's husband died and her sons died, right? Leaving Naomi is basically just like a widow of widows. And then Ruth goes with Naomi over to, back to the land of Israel and stuff like that. And the whole story revolves around the idea of a kinsman redeemer, right? Because eventually what happens is that Naomi realizes that Ruth has encountered this man named Boaz, who happens to be one of her close relatives, and they realize, hey, according to the Torah, if your family is basically destined to pass away because all the men have died, a close relative can step in, marry you, and basically provide a child for the deceased, relative, right? That's what a kinsman redeemer is. Basically like a kinsman, so a family member who redeems the family by basically saving it from annihilation, right? And that was according to the Torah. So one thing that the author highlights here is that many of the stories here highlight that Elisha is acting as a kinsman redeemer, not only to these people, but to the entire land of Israel, right? In many ways, he is functioning, and we're going to talk about this later on. It's almost like Elisha is almost a pre-incarnation of God, right? Where he's not Jesus, but he's almost as close to Jesus as you get, right? To where everywhere he goes, God is redeeming the people of Israel and saving them from death. Because every story we see, death is going to be like the starting point, and Elisha is going to produce life from it, right? And so this is what he says. Elisha's miracles reveal that his ministry is that of a kinsman redeemer, a goen. In the Old Testament, the kinsman redeemer is responsible to redeem a near relative from debt and slavery, a duty that Elisha fulfills in his dealings with the widow and her two sons. A kinsman redeemer provides an heir to a brother who dies without children, and Elisha accomplishes this for the Shunammite twice over. We're going to talk about that later. Kinsman redeemers purchase property back when poor relatives are forced to sell, and in 2 Kings chapter 8, Elisha indirectly recovers property for the Shunammite, who is forced to leave the land during 7 years of famine. By fulfilling these duties, Elisha announces in action that he has come to proclaim liberty to captives, to announce the favorable year of Yahweh, to bring a jubilee of freedom and life into the culture of death that dominates Amorite Israel. For the original exilic readers of 1st and 2nd Kings, the message is clear. While the king sowed death, there is life to be found, redemption from slavery and debt, restoration to the promised land, the gift of children, abundant life in all respects. These blessings will come to those who stay close to the prophets. Elisha forms a culture of life within the culture of death because he is very nearly an incarnation of Yahweh, the life giver, animated by the spirit of Yahweh and Elisha. His ministry foreshadows the later work of Yahweh, who promises through various prophets that he will again come near to exilic Israel as its kinsman redeemer, once again to ransom it from slavery to Babylon. Right? And so I just kind of thought it was like cool imagery. So if you think as Boaz was to Ruth, or as Yahweh is to Israel, that's what Elisha is doing here. Right? Everywhere Elisha is going, he is entering in to stories of death, and he is producing life from death. So basically what we're seeing is resurrection again and again in each story. Right? So this story begins with a widow and orphans who are near death. Yet by the end of it, there is life. And every single story is going to have that motive, right? It's like death, life, death, life, death, life. And if you remember who these books were written for, 1st and 2nd Kings were written to people who were living in exile, right? They had been exiled because of sin. And so you can see why that would be encouraging, right? Because even whenever your political leaders failed, and even whenever it seems like there's nothing but death all around you, Yahweh can step in and he can resurrect, right? And so to the original readers, that would have been super encouraging, right? They're over in Babylon reading these stories, and they're saying, okay, if God can do that then he can bring us back to the land now. And that ultimately paves the way to the cross, where Jesus dies, but he resurrects, right? And because he is our Redeemer, right? I just wanted to highlight that. I thought that was really cool. Keep that in mind.
What have the Jews done that had him exiled?
What's that?
What have the Jews done that had God exiled?
I
thought you said politically they're kicked out of the land.
Yeah, politically they're going to be, like, we're going to see that over the course of 2nd Kings.
It's going to happen? I thought it already happened.
It hasn't happened yet in 2nd Kings, right? So by the end of 2nd Kings, they're going to be exiled, right? But we haven't gotten there yet. This is basically laying the groundwork for that. All right, let's jump in. Now, a certain woman of the wives of the sons of the prophets cried out to Elisha, "Your servant, my husband, is dead, and you know that your servant feared Yahweh, and the creditor has come to take my 2 children to be his slaves." All right, there's several problems here. What is the first problem she acknowledges?
Her husband's dead.
Her husband is dead, which leaves her as a widow, and it leaves her children as orphans, right? And right off the bat, we kind of know, just because if we know the character of God, we know where the story's heading, right? Because if you read throughout the scriptures, who is God constantly telling people to take care of?
Orphans.
Widows and orphans, right? Widows and orphans are typically the ones neglected by society because widows and orphans usually have nothing to offer to people. Keep in mind, culture back then is different than culture now, right? Nowadays, women go and they get jobs and stuff like that, right? Back then, women did not really have jobs. And so if your husband died, there's your source of income. And if your kids are young enough to where they're not working yet, well, you're basically screwed, right? And so that's how that ancient culture was. And so that's why people would usually neglect widows and orphans, because what did they have to offer you? Usually people wouldn't want to marry a widow because just from that perspective, they just didn't want to do that. And so if you don't have anything to gain from it, why would you help them out? And so that's why God is constantly saying, no, you take care of the widows and orphans. You're not just taking care of people who have something to offer you. You take care of everybody, right? And so we know how God's going to step in here, right? So one issue is that there's been death, right? The husband has died, and he was a faithful man. He apparently wasn't being punished for sin or anything. We just live in a broken world where there's death. What is the second issue?
She's in debt, so much so that a creditor has threatened to take her children.
Yeah. So apparently what has happened is that whenever the husband died and they realized that they were in dire straits, they did go entrust themselves to a creditor, basically indentured servitude, right? And according to the law, that was something that you could do.
Yeah.
However, you know what you're not supposed to do? What the creditor's doing, right? So this person, he's taking advantage of their situation, and according to the law, after a certain amount of time, as an Israelite, you were supposed to free the slaves, right? So it's like, okay, you allow them to do that, you take care of them, you get them what they need, and then you free them out, right? They didn't want to just be free handouts, right? If you work to eat, you work for me, I give you what you need, I help you get back on your feet, and then I release you. That's not what this guy's doing, right? So we've got this person who is abusing the situation, taking advantage of them, and he says, you know what? I decide I want your kids as slaves. So they came from a faithful family, and they're dealing with a very unfaithful guy. And so the woman goes to the prophet and says, what do I do? Right? I need your help. Verse 2. And Elisha said to her, what shall I do for you? tell me, what do you have in the house? I think this right here is what also reminds me of the water to wine situation, right? If you remember the story of Jesus turning water to wine, you have his mother coming to him and saying, hey, they've run out of wine. And he says, woman, what does this have to do with me? Right? And so he says, what shall I do for you? Right? Like, why do you come to me? Like, what do you think that I can do about this? I'm a prophet. It's not like I have endless amounts of money. But it seems like he's saying, you came to the right person. Right? Like, what shall I do for you? Okay,
Isn't the fact that she expects so much out of him a good thing?
Yes, well, no, that's the thing, right? She's coming to the right person. Right? She is not simply going to another creditor. She's not going to the king or something. She's going to the prophet. So this testifies to her faith.
Yeah.
Right? She's coming to him saying, I need you to do something. That's good. What shall I do for you? Tell me, what do you have in the house? And she said, your servant woman has nothing in the house except a jar of oil. All right, so what do we see just in her little response there? I think there's a few things that are kind of cool.
She doesn't really have anything but oil in a jar.
Yeah, she doesn't really have much. It seems like she's probably talking about like anything of worth, because I mean, I doubt that literally her house was entirely empty, like except for just like a jar of oil just sitting in the corner. Most likely, yes, they had a bed and everything, but she's basically saying like I don't have anything worthwhile except for oil, and we know that oil was a pricey commodity, and so she's saying the only thing I have to my name is this one jar, but like that's not going to buy my kids back. What's that?
It's probably not a very big jar.
Yeah, it's just like probably a flash because like that's the best I got. It's not a lot. What can you do with that? And this is where you see the echoes of the feeding of the 5,000, right? Whenever it's like all these people are hungry, what do you have? 5 loaves and 2 fish, and God's like, I can work with that, right? And he's like, I created the universe from nothing, so like, I mean, sure, a jar of oil works. Another thing that sticks out to me is just how she refers to herself, your servant woman. I think it's cool that every time she mentions herself or her family, she's making it very clear where her allegiance lies, right? She says that your servant, my husband, right? He's Elisha's servant. And then she says, I am your servant woman, right? She's in this posture of submission. And I think that actually accentuates the, like Elisha's role here and we'll talk about this later because I'm going to quote the commentary again. It's almost like Elisha is himself a moving temple, right? Because where is the temple at? Jerusalem. But where's Jerusalem at?
In Judah.
It's in the southern kingdom of Judah. And so the northern kingdom, it has no temple, right? The only temples they've got are for idols. And so it's almost like God is providing a moving temple. It's almost like Elisha is a tabernacle. And everywhere he goes, the presence of God goes. And so whenever she says, I am your servant, she's not simply speaking about being Elisha's servant. She is God's servant, right? Because where Elisha is, there God is too, right? And I just think that's kind of cool. We'll talk about that again later. Okay. Then he said, go, ask for vessels for yourself from those outside, from all your neighbors, even empty vessels. Do not get a few. So what's he tell her to do?
Even empty ones.
Yeah. He says, I want you to go around and just track down as many jars or vessels or pots or bowls as you can find. Right? Knock on your neighbor's doors. You don't need to explain why. Just like get as many as you possibly can. Don't get a few.
Like a lot of clay and earthen pottery.
Yes. Yeah. Don't get 1 or 2. Don't get 3. I'm telling you, get as many as you can. And from her perspective, what do you think she's thinking here? Probably.
She's like, what is that gonna do?
Yeah. What are you gonna do for me out of this? Right. So I just want to highlight that because her going out in obedience is an act of faith. Because here she thinks she is on the verge of death. Because, or not even necessarily the verge of death, but like, I mean, if her sons are gone, keep in mind, if her sons are being taken as slaves, that means they've been the ones doing the work. So if she loses her sons, she's got nothing left. Death is not far behind for her, right? And so here she thinks she is in like the most like stressful moment of her life. She goes to this man of God saying, I need your help. I'm about to go bankrupt. I'm about to lose my sons. What do I do? And he says, go gather the Tupperware. It's like, huh? That's weird. Yes?
This might be a side note, or
Okay.
it might be on topic, but when Elijah tells the woman to collect vessels. Reminds me of when David collected the 5 stones for Goliath. What are these little stones going to do to a giant?
Yeah.
Or like empty glasses going to do?
Yeah. That's also another thing that we'll see throughout this. It's like 1 Corinthians 1, where God uses the weak things of the world to shame the strong. Like, God just loves using unorthodox ways.
The little things mean, like,
Yeah, I just think, like, God just loves doing that. It's like, I can't help but just think that God has a sense of humor. He just likes to entertain us or entertain himself. Where it's like, he's almost just like, they have no idea what I'm about to do, and I'm not going to let them know to the last moment. He's just a God of surprises, right? He likes to just get people to live by faith to where he's like, you're not going to understand what I'm asking you to do, but I'm going to ask you to do it anyways, and you just have to trust me. And in the end, you'll understand, but not until the end, right? And I just think that's kind of cool, right? To where, I think it's cool in theory. In practice, it doesn't feel very cool, right? Because in practice, it's like, God, I want to know exactly why you're telling me to do these things. But he's like, you don't need to understand why. You simply need to trust and obey. So he says, go out, get the vessels. Verse 4, I forgot to bold it and put it, whatever. Okay. And you shall go in and shut the door behind you and your sons and pour out into all these vessels, and you shall set aside what is full. So what's he say here?
Take the jar, go in a room, close the door behind you and your sons, and keep pouring from the jar until everything is full.
Yeah. So why does he say to shut the door?
He doesn't want the servant woman to see what he's doing.
Well, no, but they're going to be the ones in the room. So Elisha's not doing anything, right?
Oh.
The servant woman's the one doing the pouring and stuff.
So you just had to prove he's not interfering.
Yeah, like it's kind of he's just proving nobody tampered with this,
Yeah.
right? It's very similar once again to the water to wine, like the turn the water to wine. If you remember, whenever Jesus had them fill up the vessels, it says that he had them fill them to the brim, right? Because he's about to do a miracle. You don't want anybody going around later on saying, "Oh, he just took some Kool-Aid powder and threw it in there." No. It was filled to the brim. There was no room to tamper with it. So if that water turned to wine, something miraculous happened. Right? And so Elisha, he's saying, I'm not even going to be in the room with y'all. Right? Y'all go in the room, take all the jars you've got, close the door so nobody else can get in, and then just watch God provide. That's pretty cool. Right? But he also doesn't even specify, like this is what I love. He doesn't necessarily say that God will provide here. He simply says, pour out into all these vessels and you shall set aside what is full. Which is really confusing because if you've got, like the mathematical brain gets confused by this. Because here, it's like, you've got one vessel, and he just told you to get as many vessels as possible. And he says, I want you to go into a closed room, take that one vessel, and just pour into all the other vessels and set them aside once they're full. If you're thinking mathematically and logically, you're saying, Elisha, I don't think you understand how this works, right? Like, the reverse works, right? If you've got 20 vessels filled with oil, well, then you can fill up one vessel and you can have leftovers, right? That makes sense. But one vessel turning into 20, that does not make sense because mathematically, by the time you have filled up the second vessel, the first vessel should be empty. And so if you're hearing this, it's like, all right, Elisha either skipped basic mathematics or he knows something that we do not know. And so basically what they have to do is live by faith. All right? Sons, we're going to go in the room right there and we're going to close the door and we're going to fill up these jars of oil. Mom, what do you mean? There's only one jar. Let's just try. I know Mommy seems crazy right now, but we're going to do our best and see what happens. Sorry, this made me think of this. Have y'all seen the 1978 Superman movie? Like with Christopher Reeve?
Yes.
First off, if you haven't, that's your homework. It has nothing to do, it's not related to the Bible. You need to see it. It is a fantastic movie. One of the best superhero movies of all time. But what I love is whenever Superman first makes his debut, he does the classic thing where he stops the plane from crashing. And, nobody's ever heard of Superman in the story, right? Because he's just making his debut. And there's the pilot, and they're getting ready to crash. And then he, looks out, and he literally just sees Superman, holding, the wing up, and Superman just, waves at him. And then the pilot just, looks back, and he's just, in shock. And the co-pilot's like, what? What did you see? And he's like, fly. Just fly. He's just, speechless because he's like, I do not know how to explain to you what I just saw, so just fly. It's just one of those funny moments. I feel like that's how the mom's going to react right here. It's like, pour. Just pour.
Don't think.
Don't think. Just pour. Right? And that's what Elisha is asking them to do. So, she went from him and shut the door behind her and her sons. They were bringing the vessels to her, and she poured. Right? It's a really cool moment, right? The sons are bringing the vessels in, they're laying it down, and their mom pours. And then they bring another one up, and she pours. And the sons are probably peeking in there trying to make sure that she's not just no, it's filled, right? It's not like she's just pouring a little bit in each one. They're coming back filled. Now it happened that when the vessels were full, she said to her son, bring me another vessel. And he said to her, there is not one vessel more. And the oil stopped. So what happens?
They filled every vessel that they had.
They filled all of them.
Exactly so.
Exactly. Right? So it was with precision. Right? They had just enough to fill all of them. Which is crazy, because imagine if they had had better neighbors. That's just imagine they'd gathered more vessels. Whoa. But what we see here is that it's not like this was some magic jar that had endless amounts. No. Basically, it's God provided according to the measure of their faith. Right? Once they stopped gathering vessels, okay, that was it. Right? And then the vessel ran out. So it's not like there was an endless supply. And you can just imagine all the stories that would arise from this. It's oh, we found the vessel of the widow. It's out there. The Catholics have it or something. It's not like this was some endless magical vessel. No, it was just a jar, and there was nothing inherently magical about the jar. It's that God intervened into the story and produced life from death. I also I love highlighting this. I love how understated miracles are in Scripture. Right? If this were a movie, you there would be music building up right here, and it would probably be in slow motion, or not even slow motion. You would feel the tension in the room, and there's sweat beating down their faces as they poured one vessel, and then it's filled, and then all of a sudden they pour another one, and there'd be a montage of them filling one after the other, and they're all filled, and then they're all celebrating, and they're jumping around and stuff. That's how it would be in a movie, right? Because it'd be super dramatic, and they'd be this is awesome. Right here, it just says, now it happened that when the vessels were full. There's never a point where it clearly specifies that God is going to fill the vessels. Right? There's this before and after moment. It says, pour out into all of these, and you shall set aside what is full. Right? So, pour into them, set aside what's full. And then it says, now it happened that when the vessels were full. But there's never a moment that says, as they poured them, they suddenly realized it wasn't going empty. That is never stated. There's simply the before and after. Because the authors of Scripture aren't surprised by this. Right? To them, this is a small thing in the sight of Yahweh. Right? Miracles, they're nothing to him. For us, it's whoa, that's what we were saying earlier, right? We want to be there. How cool would it have been to see this? It probably would have been cool, but just knowing the guy who can do this is cooler itself. Right? The spectacle is not nearly as awesome as the one who performed the spectacle. Right? And so, it doesn't have to make this huge moment of it. It's no, yeah, the miracle's cool. Anyways, are you surprised that God can do this? This is the same one who literally parted the waters of the Red Sea. This is the same one who took down the walls of Jericho. This is the same one who took down a giant with a small stone. Right? God can do what he wants. If he wants to produce endless amounts of oil, he can do it. Right? And so I just always love how understated miracles are in the Bible. Because it's just... I know how I would tell a story. And that's not how the authors of Scripture are telling it. And I'm I like how they did it better. Because just the understated aspect of it testifies to the character of God. Right? Whereas to me, it's almost if I make a big deal out of it, it's almost doing God a disservice. it's almost like I'm saying that this was like such a big task for him. Nah. Like for us, we cannot produce oil from nothing. And therefore, if it was by our power, this would deserve a big slow motion montage. But for God, this is just as easy as like cutting a piece of bread. So it doesn't need to be overblown, right? I just think that's kind of cool, right? So just the understatedness of it actually gives glory to God. Does that make sense? I just think that's kind of cool. All right. So he said to her, there is not one vessel more, and the oil stopped. Then she came and told the man of God. Who's the man of God? Elisha. Very good. And he said, go sell the oil and pay your debt, and you and your sons can live on the rest. All right. How does the story come to an end? Thumbs up. What does he tell her?
Everything will be alright.
Use it. Use it.
Not only will everything be all right, seems like everything's going to be great.
More than alright.
It's not good. It's great. Like this is so. What problem did she come to him with?
She's in debt and her sons are about to be sold.
Yeah, she's in debt and my sons are about to be sold. What problems did he solve?
Yeah, trust God to solve it.
Well, he solved the debt problem and then more.
Yes.
Gave her enough oil to live on for we don't know how long.
Yeah. Right? So he gave in excess. Right? He didn't simply solve the problem. He went above and beyond. He solved the debt problem, but then he also gave life. Right? He went above and beyond and said, you know what? Not only will I cancel your debt, I will also give you a livelihood. You know what this sounds like to me? The book of Romans. For the wages of sin is death, but the free gift of God is eternal life in Christ Jesus. A lot of times this is what we miss in the gospel. Like, God didn't simply get rid of death. Right? Like, because the thing is, we don't even deserve this life in and of itself. So this life in and of itself is a gift. So not only did he get rid of death, but he also gave us in excess. He gave us life eternal. Right? And I'm not saying that those are the same thing. I'm saying that this is the character of God. Right? God is not a God who just gives, like he's not stingy. He's not Mr. Krabs, right, from SpongeBob. Right? He's not a cheap God who's always just like, counting pennies and stuff like that. No, God, he has an endless storehouse of things to give. And this is what he loves to do. Right? This is why David in Psalm 23 says, surely goodness and hesed will follow me all the days of my life.
Cup overflows.
Yeah, my cup overflows. Yeah, that's also Psalm 23, right? Yeah, this is what God does, right? This is why Jesus says, I want you to have joy, like my joy in you, joy to the full, right? I want you to have abundant life. God doesn't simply take care of the problems. He goes above and beyond, and he leaves you overflowing, right? So he says, you want your debt canceled? I'll do you one better. I will cancel your debt, and I will provide for you and your sons for the foreseeable future.
I wish someone would cancel my debt.
All of our debts are canceled in Christ, brother.
Amen.
Also, I don't know if it'd be like a stretch because I don't know how the rest of the chapter pans out, but at least so far, like it seems like the miracle is like somewhat private in a sense. Like to me, that kind of makes me think of Jesus, like how he kind of starts off with like he does kind of work more privately, like individually, whereas like he steadily grows like more and more like public.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's like.
Well, that is the one thing that we're going to see with Elisha. That's like the Elijah-Elisha contrast. Elijah is like all spectacle and like big show, kind of like John the Baptist.
Mm.
Whereas Elisha, it seems like it's more like personal interactions, right? To where it is more intimate. Even though, to be fair, this does kind of call back to a story that we had with Elijah. If you remember, there was the widow of Zarephath. And remember how her and her son were about to die? And they were literally on their last loaf of bread? Do you remember that?
Oh, yeah.
Like this is back in 1 Kings. And so this story does call back to that. But once again, you see what's happening. Elijah went into Gentile territory and found a widow there, right? The widow of Zarephath, and he provided for her there. Whereas Elisha is doing this in Israel. Whereas whenever you have Elijah in Israel, it's usually more public spectacle because he's calling them to repentance, and it's a big show. Whereas Elisha, he's got these more private interactions where he's almost forming an inner Israel.
He was helping out someone who was already faithful to God.
Yes.
Who had already shown faith in God.
Yeah. And so that is a good connection to make. All right, let us move on. Verses 8 through 10. Go for it, Sean.
Now there came a day when Elisha passed over to Shunem, where there was a prominent woman, and she prevailed upon him to eat food. Now it happened, as often as he passed by, they turned in there to eat food. And she said to her husband, "Behold now, I know that this is a holy man of God passing by us continually. Please, let us make a little walled upper chamber, and let us set a bed for him there, and a table, and a chair, and a lampstand. And it will be, when he comes to us, that he can turn in there."
Okay, so we continue. Elisha seems to have a lot of interactions with women. My junior hires would say he's got that W Riz. But I'm not saying there's anything romantic involved with this, but that's how my junior hires act anytime a man interacts with a woman at all. Because they're so awkward around girls that they think that if you interact with a female, it's got to be romantic. But that's not what's going on here. That was an unnecessary tangent. What happens here?
So a woman is in. I am not familiar with what she knows.
Yeah, I'm going to look it up where it's on the map.
I think it's a city.
Well, it is a city. It's over, it's kind of near Samaria. Just north of Jezreel.
Again, it shows that Elisha already has a prior connection to this person because it says that he would go through there often and eat food at this specific house. And the lady is aware that he's coming by, and so she's like, "Oh, let's go make a room for him so he has a place to sleep when he comes by."
Yeah.
Just doing a courtesy, kind
Yeah.
of like setting up a bed and breakfast.
Yeah.
I know so
Yeah.
she has recognition of his status.
Well, yeah, so you see where she recognizes this is a holy man of God, right? This man is set apart.
How do they know each other? How does she recognize that? I wonder.
That's a good question.
Well, I do think that there is a connection between them because it says that he passed by often and turned in there to eat food. There, I'm guessing, implies the house of the woman and her husband.
Yeah.
So I don't know if it makes me think of with King David. I mean, I don't know if that's probably not an intentional connection, but it just makes me think of whenever he's like sitting in his palace and he's looking at the ark in the tent, and he's like, it's not the same thing, obviously, but he just recognizes that like the ark needs something like better.
I think it is the same thing, Sean. That's what I'm about to read. No, like, because the thing is, like, you're spot on. Like, I didn't even think of that connection, but I think it like, I don't even know if that's what that's echoing, but I think that's 100% what we're supposed to get out of it.
I see.
Because it's almost like she views him as an Ark of the Covenant or as a tabernacle that deserves a better place, right? She sees this man constantly on the move, and she says, "This is a holy man of God. Why don't we keep him here?" Right? Like he's always coming and eating here. Why not give him a place to stay? And like that, I think that's 100% what it like. I don't know what's calling back to that story, but it's the same mindset. And so, since you brought that up, bring out the commentary real quick. I was going to save this till we got to verse 10, because I think verse 10 is the thing that kind of seals this, because she lists out exactly the different things that she wants to put in there, and much of it calls back to the things that you put in a temple. So, let me just read an extended portion of this again real quick. The Shunammite recognizes that Elisha is holy, sanctified by Yahweh's Spirit. Throughout Elisha's ministry, the presence of Yahweh moves around the country with him, serving as a chariot of Yahweh. Like Jesus later, Elisha heads a counter-temple movement and acts as a traveling temple, a human tabernacle that bears the life-giving glory of Yahweh. Elisha supplies everything that united Israel seeks from the temple: the water of life and cleansing, food, access to the presence of God. Like the temple in Jerusalem, Elisha is Israel's Garden of Eden, its holy mountain, the embodiment of Yahweh within Israel. Elisha is the house of prayer for all nations. Cut off from the temple, the northern kingdom is also cut off from the life-giving waters of the temple's ministry. If you remember the temple itself, like the design of it had like water everywhere.
Okay.
Right. Yahweh does not abandon Israel to desolation, however, but he provides water to the sons of the prophets through the human temple Elisha. Through Elisha, water at Jericho is purified. Through Elisha's word, water comes from nowhere to sustain the armies and the animals of the 3 kings. That was last chapter. And then goes on for a little bit longer. All this explains why the Shunammite sets up a little temple for Elisha in the upper room, a small-scale holy mountain, right? Because if you remember, like, temples were always placed on mountains. Where she places a bed, a table, a chair, and the word for lampstand there in Hebrew is menorah, right? So she placed a table, a chair, and a menorah, the same furniture as in the Jerusalem temple, right? The table equals showbread, the chair and throne equals the ark, the bed equals the altar. This is also why Elisha speaks to the woman through his priest, Gehazi. Why the Shunammite visits the prophet on Sabbaths and new moons, as we're going to see in a few verses, and why the sons of the prophets bring him first fruits, as we're going to see at the end of the chapter. What Israel normally expects at the temple is available from Elisha. What Israelites would expect to do at the temple, they do in the presence of Elisha. He is a proto-incarnation, so much that the title man of God might almost be rendered as God-man. So, once again, it's not that he is the incarnated God, right? It's not that he is Jesus, but he is as close to that as you can get, right? Israel has no temple, and so God is using Elisha as a portable temple. And that foreshadows what we are, right, as the church, right? Because as the church, we are supposed to be to the world what Elisha is, right? We are portable temples with the Spirit of God in us, going around, planting little pockets of heaven. And so I think that's 100% what's happening. She sees the ark of God dwelling in a tent, moving around like a tabernacle. She says, I want to build a temple, right? Let's build a temple in our house. Let's let him live here. So let's walk through this very briefly. There came a day when Elisha passed over to Shunem, where there was a prominent woman, and she prevailed upon him to eat food. She's prominent, that means she's wealthy, she has a big house, right? And she would ask him to eat food. Now it happened as often as he passed by, he turned in there to eat food. So apparently he never turned her down, right? Hey, he's in ministry, ministers don't make a lot of money, free food's free food. He's like, sure. And especially, once again, prominent woman, probably good meal, right? And it would suggest, once again, that she is a faithful person, right? Typically, heathens don't want to hang out with holy men of God that often. And once again, eating bread is like breaking that's fellowship. And she said to her husband, behold now, I know that this is a holy man of God passing by us continually. He's always in the area, right? And he's different. He's set apart. Please, let us make a little walled upper chamber, and let us set a bed for him there, and a table, and a chair, and a lampstand. Right? So it almost seems like this wasn't already a pre-made upper room. It's like they're adding on to the house to accommodate him. Right? So their house is the metaphorical hill, and his little room on top is going to be the metaphorical temple, which kind of lets you know how far Israel has gone astray. Right? This is not the magnificent temple of Yahweh. This is a single little room on top of a mansion. Right? So it's still nice, but like this ain't what we had in Solomon's day. And it will be when he comes to us that he can turn in there. Right? So he's not going to stay forever, but when he does stay, like let's just build him a place. Right? Let's show him that respect. Right? So he doesn't have to like sleep on the couch or something. No, let's give him a place where he can feel at home. All right. Let's continue with the story.
Now it happened that one day he came there and turned into the upper chamber, and there he lay down. Then he said to Gehazi, his young man, call the Shunammite. So he called her, and she stood before him. And he said to him, say now to her, behold, you have been careful for us with all this care. What can I do for you? Would you be spoken for to the king or to the commander of the army? And she answered, I live among my own people. So he said, what then is there to be done for her? And Gehazi answered, surely she has no son, and her husband is old. And he said, call her. So he called her, and she stood in the doorway. Then he said, at this season next year you will embrace a son. And she said, no, my lord, O man of God, do not lie to your servant woman. Then the woman conceived and bore a son at that season the next year, as Elisha had said to her.
I feel like Rocky said thinking that this sounds like something.
Yes, it does.
What's it sound like, Rocky?
Genesis.
Genesis. Very good. What's it sound like in Genesis?
Sarah and Abraham.
Sarah and Abraham. Very good. it's almost like we're just getting all the Bible stories. That's what I'm saying. This is
Probably the best chapter ever.
That's what I'm saying. This is a fun chapter. It's just, there's like every chapter you're like, I get it. And this is why we need to study the Old Testament, right? That's what I'm saying. Like, it drives me nuts whenever people only talk about the New Testament, because the New Testament is fantastic, but the Old Testament is so good, right? It's like there's all these like connections, and you're like, I've read this before. And especially when you know how much the Jewish people were like built upon the scriptures, like you know that they're making these connections. They're probably making more connections than we make, right? So it's so cool. Let's walk through it. Now it happened that one day he came there and turned into the upper chamber, and there he lay down. Right? So, if we're kind of reading the temple imagery into this, Yahweh has entered into his temple and he is resting. Right? But basically, he is doing, like, they didn't build the house for nothing. Right? They built this thing for him, and he is there. He's chilling out. He's resting.
It's like a little studio apartment for him.
Exactly. Little studio apartment for Elisha. He was the original hipster. Then he said to Gehazi, his young man, call this Shunammite. Real brief word on Gehazi. Next week, you are going to come to despise this guy. Gehazi is a frustrating character. We will talk about that later. But just a foreshadowing. Don't get too attached to him because you're going to be frustrated even more. Okay, so he said to Gehazi, his young man, call this Shunammite. So he called her, and she stood before him. What happens?
Before the Shunammite.
He's basically telling his disciple, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
Call in the woman who, did this for us.
Yeah. Yeah, so he's just laying down, and he says, hey, go get the woman for us. So she comes in. And this is where I think that the temple thing makes a lot more sense. Because if you can just picture the room now, this is kind of awkward. Because now you've got Elisha seemingly laying on his bed, just resting. And then the woman is standing there before him, but they're never going to directly speak to each other. It's going to be like telephone, where like Elisha is going to speak to Gehazi, and Gehazi's going to speak to the woman, and the woman's going to like, it's just, they're not directly talking. Whereas
it almost makes you wonder if, like, for whatever reason, their dialects were different, and
it's possible, yeah.
Perhaps
Gehazi's the interpreter.
The Shunammite dialect was slightly different than whatever Elisha was accustomed to, and so he's just using.
Yeah, that is possible. Like ultimately, we just don't know. But but I do like the imagery of the temple thing, to where it's almost like Gehazi is the metaphorical priest, right? He is Moses going up and down the mountain, delivering the words of God to the people of Israel. He is the priest going into the Holy of Holies and coming back out, right? That is almost like that's the imagery going on here. So called the Shunammite. He called her. She stood before him, and he said to him, right? He doesn't say to her. He speaks to Gehazi, and he said to him, "Say now to her, behold, you have been careful for us with all this care. What can I do for you? Would you be spoken for to the king or to the commander of the army?" So what does he ask?
He's basically saying, how can I reward you for showing me this kindness, for giving me the courtesy of having my own room in your house.
Yeah, he says, you have done all this for me. What can I do for you? Did the woman ask for anything in return?
Nope.
No. She was just doing it out of the kindness of her heart. But this is what he's asking. Now, there's several things that this brings to mind. One of them is something that Sean already mentioned, but it's almost a reversal of it, kind of. Right? So, if you remember, whenever David is standing in his palace, he looks out at all that God's given him, and he says, God has given me a kingdom and a palace, but he's dwelling in a tent. What can I do for him? But then, this is where you actually do kind of see the same thing cropping in. How does God respond to that?
He says, you will not build the temple with your lifetime, but your son will.
Yeah. He says, David, it's not your job to build me a house, because I'm going to build a house for you. Which, once again, you see the character of God. God says, you're right, I have given you a lot, but I'm not done yet. I'm going to give you an eternal covenant. And it's like, It's one of the coolest moments, right? 2 Samuel chapter 7. Go read it again if you haven't read it recently. Super good. But I love that that's just the character of God, right? He's a God who keeps on giving. And here Elisha is, and he's voicing that same idea, right? You've done so much for me. What can I do for you? It's almost like he's blending King David and God together, right? He's using David's logic, but God's heart. And then, what else does it possibly remind you of? Especially if we've been thinking this temple imagery and stuff. Or even maybe before the temple was built, but after the interaction with David. Maybe an interaction with David's son.
Let's say the dream.
Yeah, the dream at the beginning of Solomon's reign. Remember, God shows up to Solomon in a dream and says, what shall I do for you? Right? Ask anything. What would I do for you? Right? It's trying to expose the person's heart. Right? What do you want? Of anything, what do you want? How did Solomon respond?
Wisdom.
Yeah, he says, I want a hearing heart to know what the people need and to govern the people. I need wisdom and discernment. And God says, great answer, I'll give you that and more. That's kind of similar right here, right? It's just a blanket thing. I mean, Elisha even gives options. Like, what can I do for you? Would you be spoken for to the king or to the commander of the army? Like, what do you want me to do? He's like, I'm a prophet. I'm a man of God. I can access anybody, right? You want me to say something to the king, put in a good word for you? I'll do it. You want me to speak to the commanders of the army, get you like bodyguards? I'll do it, right? I have that access. Like, basically he's saying, the world is your oyster. Ask for me anything that you want, right? And she answered, I live among my own people. So he said, what then is to be done for her? So what does she say right there? What is her answer? I live among my own people. It's kind of a weird response.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to... It's almost like she doesn't want to be, like, given a higher status. She just wants to continue serving the people she already serves.
Yeah, I think that's, as best I can tell, that's what she's saying. I think it's like, we know that she's a prominent woman, but she doesn't want accolades and like big stuff. She's like, no.
Yeah.
I live among the people. I don't need anything from the king. I don't need bodyguards. I live among the people. Like, she's basically saying, I'm content, right? Like, hey, I am fine right here. And so he said, what then is to be done for her, right? So she won't ask for anything. So he says to Gehazi, what can we do for her? And Gehazi answers and says, truly she has no son and her husband is old. What's the implication?
He can't.
Well, so it could be that, like, so first off that she's barren, and it could be that he can't give a child, but the thing is, men in general can have kids to a very old age. What do you think Gehazi's being more mindful of? She has no child and the husband is old.
Her being a widow, maybe?
Yeah, like, her husband's going to die at some point, and soon she will be put in the same situation as the person that we just saw, right? The widow. And so it's like, well, she might be content right now, but sometime in the future, that money that she has is going to go away very quickly, right? Because she has no son or an heir to take care of her. And so Gehazi, like, this is actually a pretty good moment, right? He's like, hey, this is a very practical need that would benefit her very well. She's not willing to ask for it, even though as a woman in this culture, you would definitely want a child. But it seems like she in general is just a humble person who's not necessarily willing to ask for it. Or maybe just she's bashful, right? You know, it's like, no, I'm fine. I didn't do this for anything. Like, she doesn't want people to misunderstand why she did this, right? No, she's like, I just want you to live here. I didn't do this for anything in return. But Gehazi says, hey, she doesn't have a kid. Her husband's old. Let's be real. He's about 3 feet in the ground already. He's going to die one day. And she needs somebody to take care of her. And he said, call her. So he called her, and she stood in the doorway. Then he said, like, even the imagery of her standing in the doorway, that calls back to Abraham and Sarah. If you remember, the Abraham and Sarah thing, do you remember what the scene was like in that context whenever God was talking to Abraham?
Sarah was in the tent.
Yeah, Sarah was in the tent, leaning through the door, like listening through the door, right? And so just the imagery of this is really cool. So Gehazi is the Abraham of the story, and then the woman is the Sarah of the story, And then who does that make? Elisha. Who's he parallel with?
The two people who came to talk to.
Well, so there are three of them, but specifically it's the angel of Yahweh, right? The messenger of Yahweh, which is God, right? And so the parallel is still there. So she stood in the doorway. Then he said, and now he directly speaks to her. Then he said, at this season next year, you will embrace a son. How did Sarah respond when she heard this?
Say laughed.
She laughed, right? And then God's like, why did Sarah laugh? And Sarah's like, I didn't laugh. And God's like, no, yes, you did. You laughed. It's one of the most awkward moments in the entire Bible. I love it. And she said, no, my Lord, O man of God, do not lie to your servant woman. Right? She's like, hey, are you making fun of me? Right? She's like, no, we know I can't have kids. Like, we don't know how old she is, but I'm assuming that this isn't like a huge age gap here. I'm assuming that she's also probably on the older side of things. She's like, no, like, don't mess around with me. Like, don't give me hope. Right? She's what is that? It's like Hawkeye from, or I guess Ronan or whatever.
Don't do that.
Yeah, don't do that. Don't give me hope. That's basically what she's saying. No, my Lord, like, don't lie. But God does not lie.
Amen.
And so I love that we don't even see the response. We just see the conclusion. Once again, it's understated, right? If this were another, like, if this were a movie, it would fast forward to a few weeks later, and she's like doubled over, like throwing up, and then they're like, oh, I'm pregnant, and then they're like rejoicing. No. This is God doing his thing. We don't need to draw emphasis to this. It says, do not lie to your servant woman, and then in between the lines, it says, God wasn't lying. Because you jump to the next thing, then the woman conceived and bore a son at that season the next year, as Elisha said to her. Boom. Right? Because for God, it's like that. Right? So you've had death giving way to life, right? You had the first woman, her husband died, but by the end, her entire family survived. Here, the woman's womb was dead, right? It was barren, but now there's new life, right? So death to life, death to life.
This will not end in death.
This will not end in death. Oh, very good.
The glory of God.
Yep. All right, go for it.
Then the child was grown, and the day came that he went out to his father to the reapers. And he said to his father, my head, my head. And he said to his young man, carry him to his mother. Then he carried him and brought him to his mother, and he sat on her knees until noon, and then died. Then she went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God, and shut the door behind him and went out. And she called to her husband and said, please send me one of the young men and one of the donkeys, that I may run to the man of God and return. And he said, why will you go to him today? It is neither new moon nor Sabbath. And she said, it is well. Then she saddled a donkey and said to her young man, drive and go. Do not hold back the pace of the ride for me unless I tell you. So she went and came to the man of God to Mount Carmel.
All right, very good. I just want to look up something real quick. I think that's it. Yeah, cool. All right, so what happens here? Quite the plot twist.
The kid dies.
Yeah. 3 words to just like bum out the entire room.
Sorry.
The kid dies. Yeah, well, very true. What'd you say, Rocky?
She has a kid and then he dies.
Yeah. I mean, think about that. It's like, you will have a kid this next year. She had the kid the next year. 2 verses later, kid's dead. What? Yeah. But in many ways, doesn't that also seem to kind of call back to the Abraham and Isaac thing? Like, you wait 25 years for Isaac to be born, and then all of a sudden, like, a chapter later, God's like, take your son and go sacrifice him. And it's like,
What?
is this a joke?
It does kind of give that kind of...
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Let's walk through it. Then the child was grown. So years pass.
We don't know what that means.
Yeah, we don't know how old he is. I'm assuming he's not 25 years old, but I'm assuming he's probably somewhere between 8 to 15. All right, just because he's still called a child, and just certain things in here will suggest that he's probably still pretty young. So the child was grown, and the day came that he went out to his father to the reapers. So what's going on?
They're in a field of some sort.
They're in a field doing work, which once again probably suggests that he's probably early teenage years. He's probably starting to work with his dad, learning the ways, going about doing the work. So they're out in the field, and he said to his father, "My head, my head." And he said to his young man, "Carry him to his mother." So what happens there?
The son's head starts to hurt, and the father turns to one of the other workers in the field and is like, "Take him to his mom."
Yeah. So we don't know exactly what happened. We don't know if it's like he has like a splitting migraine. We don't know if like there's a tumor, or we don't. For all we know, something happened and he like injured himself, right? But for some reason his head is hurting, and he comes yelling to his dad. He's like, "Oh, my head, like it hurts." It's like there's something wrong, right? We don't know if there's blood everywhere or what, but something's going wrong. And I'm assuming it's not like he got hurt, just because I think at that point the dad would have been like, "Let me take care of him." It seems like the dad is like, "Okay, he's got a bad headache. You go home early. Just go to your mom, and I'm gonna keep working." Right. Also, in general, it just seems like the mom, like, I don't really know what to do with this information. It seems like the mom is the more faithful of the family members. It's not that the guy isn't faithful. It just seems like the mom seems to be like the proactive one in the family. Which might in and of itself also be an indictment. Maybe that's what's going on here. It might be an indictment on the culture at the time. Because biblically speaking, the male is supposed to be the leader of the family. And there's just not any godly males. Right? And so, I mean, this guy seems to be relatively godly, but like he's not fulfilling the leadership role that was given to him, right? To where it seems like the mom is like the spiritual like heavy lifter in the family. I wouldn't read like too much into that. I just think that's interesting that it's like the moment that this kid goes and spends time with his dad, he starts dying. And then what does that do? Go to your mom. Like it seems like if this would like it seems like it's trying to paint not a horrible image of the dad, but just like, you're not supposed to respect him as much as you respect a mom, right? He's just not as proactive. Was somebody going to say something? I feel like somebody was like, maybe not. I don't know. Okay. So he said to his father, "My head, my head." And he said to his young man, "Carry him to his mother." Then he carried him and brought him to his mother, and he sat on her knees until noon, and then died.
Bummer.
Yeah. Nick always wrote it in with just the perfect words of compassion. Note to self: if your child dies, do not go to Nick for comfort. My kid died. Womp womp. So, jeez. Terrible. Oh, man. So the kid, his head is hurting. The dad sends him home from work. Apparently this was early in the morning. And within hours he's dead. Right? He's just sitting there till noon. And all because he's sitting on the lap doesn't mean that this kid's like 4 years old. I think this is just what a mother does when she's grieving over her child. I don't care if he's 40 years old. She's pulling him into his lap, right? And she's probably like, "Oh no, like, what's happening?" Because think about it. I mean, we haven't really seen her reaction to this son, but Elisha and Gehazi agreed that this is apparently the most meaningful thing that they could give her. And she seems like a pretty grateful person who's very content in life. And so she appreciates this child. And any mother is going to grieve the situation, but this woman in particular, like, this isn't just a baby. This baby is a supernatural gift from God, right? I mean, this is a gift that God gave her. And now this poor child, he goes out to work with his dad, comes home and dies in her arms. This is terrible. The question now becomes, how is she going to respond? Also, just to highlight, death, right? The story won't end in death, though.
So I'm trying to remember.
I have a feeling.
I'm trying to remember the way that the woman responded with Elijah with her son dying, because I think that it was like, wasn't it kind of negative at first?
Let me see.
She was kind of like, "You kind of mock me now" or something.
Yeah, I will go look at that. Somebody was going to say something over there.
I just have a prediction, but we'll go on.
What's your prediction? Just because I need time to look this up.
She's gonna go meet Elisha, and he's gonna come back, and her son's gonna become alive again, and it's gonna remind the story of how Jesus. That's my prediction.
It's going to be similar to that. It's going to be similar. Let's see. All right, so this, like you highlighted, this does call back to what happened to Elijah in 1 Kings chapter 17. It happened after all these things that the son of the woman, the mistress of the house, became sick. And his sickness was so severe that there was no breath left in him. In other words, the kid died. So she said to Elijah, "What do I have to do with you, O man of God? You have come to me to bring my iniquity to remembrance and to put my son to death." Yeah, so that was what it was. It seems like her conscience afflicted her, and there was some past sin that she was aware of, and she says, "What? You just came here to like kill my son to make me feel guilty? I thought you were a good guy." Like, so she's upset with him, and he said to her, "Give me your son." Right, and so he ends up taking care of the situation. The kid comes back to life. But look at this woman's response. This woman, she's cool, right? She deserves a better man. That's all I'm saying. I'm going out way too harsh against the husband. Like, the husband probably isn't that bad, but then she went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God, and shut the door behind him and went out. What's up with that?
So she just placed him in Elisha's room, like the chamber that he had stayed in.
Yeah.
And
Why would you do that?
maybe she had converted it into his room. I don't know.
Okay.
Or maybe she's just anticipating, like she's preparing for the fact that she's going to get Elisha.
Yeah. I think that this woman, she knows the story doesn't end like this. Because she understands why this child was given to her. It's like Abraham and Isaac, right? Abraham, like we read this in the book of Hebrews, right? Abraham, the reason he was willing to sacrifice Isaac is because he knew that God had made a promise to him. And even if he killed Isaac, he had confidence that God would bring him back. Because there's no way that this story ended with Isaac's death.
She recognized that it was a test of her faith.
Yeah, so this woman, she recognizes that. And so instead of going and organizing a funeral, where does she go? To the metaphorical temple. And she drops the boy's body in the very place where Elisha used to rest. He's not there though, right? Years have passed, right? It's not that he's like permanently stayed there. He would still come and go, right? He wasn't there at the time.
He's apparently up on Mount Carmel.
Yeah, which is interesting because we've read stories there too, right? Crazy. So exciting. So I just love that, right? This woman, she has so much faith, right? Rather than getting mad and storming off, she gets up, carries her child upstairs, and places him in the metaphorical temple.
Would it be almost, would the imagery be kind of like as a sacrifice, like on the altar? Or
Well, yeah, 'cause, I mean, that's what the imagery he said in his, like, in the commentary, he said that the bed represented the altar. Yeah, so that makes sense, right?
so it's like literally giving up your one and only son as like
Yeah.
a sacrifice. Yeah.
Look at that. Oh, this is great. This is fantastic. I love it. Dude, you're just like, you're locked into this. This is great. I guess you're usually locked in all the time, but this is, I love it. Like you're pulling out like things that like I hadn't thought of and that this guy didn't talk about. Like, I love when this happens. All right. She called her husband and said, "Please send me one of the young men and one of the donkeys that I may run to the man of God and return." And he said, "Why do you need the donkeys if you're going to run?" That's a joke. Obviously, she's not literally going to run. She's just saying she wants to make a speedy trip, right? I just thought that was funny. Okay. So she says, "Hey, give me the young men, one of the donkeys. I got to go make a trip real quick." Seemingly, like, she doesn't even tell him that the kid is dead, right? Which once again calls back to Abraham and Sarah, right? What are you going to go do? Me and Isaac just got to go make a trip real quick. We're going to go worship the Lord. We'll be back in 3 days, right? Doesn't tell Sarah anything. But now the roles are reversed, right? The new Sarah is now not telling Abraham, right? She says, "Hey, everything's fine back at home." She's going to literally say, "It is well," in a second, right? And she says, "Hey, real quick, could you just give me some men and some donkeys?" Which, once again, Abraham and Sarah, Abraham loaded up the donkey and he brought some men with him and they went out, right? So, like, the parallels are definitely there. It's supposed to call back to that, which the altar thing just makes sense. Except Isaac is already on the altar, right?
Yeah,
it's like,
that's true.
It's like, okay.
Yeah.
And he said, "Why will you go to him today? It's neither new moon nor Sabbath." So apparently she only typically visited the prophet on feast days, right? New moon would be a festival day and the Sabbath is a festival day. And the guy's like, "Honey, Like, he seemingly thought that his son just had, like, a bad migraine. And it's like, why are you going to visit the man of God now? Like, it's kind of a weird day. It's just Monday. Am I missing something? Did I forget to check the calendar? Is it special? And then she said this. It is well. I'm telling you, this woman's awesome. Right? Like, this is faith. Like, she's apparently super calm and composed. She's just like, no, it's fine. Everything's good, honey. It could be that she's just living by faith, or it could be that she's just a woman. Where you're like, is everything okay? Yeah, it's fine. That's how women typically respond. Not speaking from experience. No, I'm not kidding. Well, actually, I'm not kidding at all. I said I'm kidding because I was trying to lighten it, but no, I'm not kidding. That's how women are. It's frustrating. No, but this woman actually says it as well. And this is where I do have to bring up that one story which Pastor Rob has told several times in church, but I just can't not mention this. Horatio Spafford, right? The guy who wrote the song, It Is Well With My Soul. Like, if y'all have heard his story, it's amazing, right? To where, I forget the exact, like, the setup for it, but him and his family were going to be sailing overseas. I think it was to go to some conference or something like that. I don't remember the exact reason why. But his wife and his children, they left ahead of him because he had something he had to do back home. And then he was going to come afterwards. But while his wife and children were sailing across sea, like, the ship ended up wrecking, or there was like a fire or something, to where ultimately she was the only survivor. A few days later, she gets back to land. She sends like a telegram to him thing and says like I think she says sole survivor or something like that. Like the phrase is like, shipwrecked, I alone am left. Right? So basically communicating all of our children are dead. Right? Well, a few days later, now he's getting on a boat to sail across the sea because now he needs to comfort his wife over their grieving their children. And as they're going across the sea, some of the people in the boat come and tell him, hey, this is roughly the spot where you're like the ship wrecked and your children died. Right? So obviously they didn't know where the bodies were at or anything like that, but they said this is roughly the spot. And this guy on the boat, he writes the song, It Is Well. Right? When peace like a river tendeth my way, when sorrow like sea billows roll, whatever the it's such a good song, right? It is well with my soul. And I didn't fact check this, but I did hear one person claim this. I need to check, but some people say that it was actually reflecting on this chapter that caused him to write that, right? Because here you have a woman who has lost a child, and out of faith, she says, "It is well." So one of the most beloved hymns that we sing comes from 2 Kings of all places. Crazy. But that was one response, right? It is well. And then she gets on the donkey and she's just like singing through tears, with my soul, with my soul. And the young men traveling with her just like echoing in the background. So she sat on the donkey and said to her young man, drive and go. Do not hold back the pace of the ride for me unless I tell you. Right? She's like, we got to talk to this guy. Right? Don't slow down. Don't hold back the pace. We need to talk to Elisha. She seems to think that he can do something about it. Which is cool because, once again, the kid is dead. Right? It's not that the kid is sick. It's not that the oil is running out. Her child is physically dead. Right? This is not, oh no, I'm afraid we're about to die. Oh no, my womb is barren. No. The kid is dead. His corpse is literally decaying in her house. But she still thinks that the prophet can do something. Don't hold back the pace. Let's go. So she went and came to the man of God to Mount Carmel. All right, real quick. What do you think of when you think about Carmel?
Elijah and the prophets of Baal.
Elijah and the prophets of Baal. Yeah, right? You think of God triumphing over idolatry and the God of all life producing death to the pagan worshipers, right? And that's because in many ways that's what this story is all about, right? We're not going to linger about the imagery there, but he doesn't have to tell us exactly where Elisha's at, right? What we do need to know is that this was it's not a long journey, but it's a lengthy journey, right? It's not like This isn't like multiple weeks or anything like that, but it's not just like an hour there, an hour back, right? It took time to get there. But the main thing is you have to read this over the whole thing, right? Elisha is living in a pagan land, but Yahweh is still triumphing over the idols, right? So the land is worshiping idols, and therefore idolatry produces death. Yahweh is stepping into this culture of death, and he's producing life, right? And that's exactly what happened at Mount Carmel, right? You have God triumphing over Baal. Well, that's what God is continuing to do through Elisha, but he's doing it in a different way. He's not doing it by simply killing off the pagan prophets. He's doing it by bringing dead things back to life, right? And so it's like he's changing his approach, and that's ultimately just, I don't know. I think that's kind of cool. All right, we continue.
Now it happened that when the man of God saw her at a distance, he said to Gehazi his young man, "Behold, there is the Shunammite. Please run now to meet her and say to her, 'Is it well with you? Is it well with your husband? Is it well with the child?' And she answered, 'It is well.' Then she came to the man of God to the hill and took hold of his feet, and Gehazi came near to push her away. But the man of God said, 'Let her alone, for her soul is bitter within her, and Yahweh has hidden it from me and has not told me.' Then she said, 'Did I ask for a son from my Lord? Did I not say, do not deceive me?'"
Good stuff.
This is a bit more of a negative reaction.
Kind of, but I think it's setting up something good, right? To where I think this is her building a case at the very end there, right? I don't think it's necessarily her like accusing him. I think it's more like her saying, like, she's almost like saying, like, I know you better than this, right? I told you this would happen, and so I know that you've got something planned. You can do something, right? Like, I think that's kind of where she's getting at here. And I think it's also just a realistic scenario, right? She's not perfect, but I don't think we're necessarily supposed to look at this in a horrible way. What happens here? Just somebody summarize it real quick, then we'll walk through it.
She meets Elijah.
Yep.
He says everything's fine. Wink, wink, everything's fine.
It is well. Yeah.
And she holds on to his feet, which reminds me of another Jesus story, but I can't remember. Where a lady holds Jesus' robe or something.
Oh, so so there's several stories, right? That's what I'm saying. A lot of this, like the imagery in the Gospels, are definitely calling back to moments like this. Because you have one story where a woman grabs the tassels of Jesus' garments, right, and she's healed. Then you have another one where a woman comes and anoints Jesus' feet with oil, which is almost like combining the feet and the oil thing. And then you also, this also reminds me of Lazarus, right? The sisters of Lazarus, whenever he's dead, right? And so there's all this imagery going on here that I think the Gospels are intentionally calling back to, right? Just like John the Baptist was the Elijah to come, well, Jesus is the Elisha to come, right? It's kind of passing the torch. And this is especially true in the Gospel of Matthew. Because in the Gospel of Matthew, you've got to realize that like Matthew is framing his entire Gospel to where Jesus is living out the history of Israel. And so whenever you get to the Elisha portion, the imagery is super prevalent. All right. Now it happened that when the man of God saw her at a distance, he said to Gehazi, his young man, "Behold, there's the Shunammite." He's like, "Whoa, what's she doing in these parts? That's crazy. She's usually down in Shunem. Usually we come to her. What's she doing here? Please run now to meet her and say to her, 'Is it well with you? Is it well with your husband? Is it well with the child?'" All right, so what does Elisha send Gehazi to do?
She's doing.
The lady, is everything all right?
Yeah, is everything okay? Then there's two ways to read this, and I think both are probably valid. On one hand, it could just be that they are on such friendly terms. He's like, "Hey, how you doing? What's going on?" The other way, and I think this is probably more likely, is that he's like, "Okay, if she is coming to me, there must be something wrong."
Especially with verse 27.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, because whenever she gets closer, he's going to be like, "Oh, crud. Like, there is something definitely wrong." But at the very least, he's like, hey, Gehazi, go down to her and just see if everything's okay. Is everything okay with you? How's your husband doing? Right? Did he die? He was kind of old. All right. How's your kid? Right? So just, is it well? Is it well? Is it well? I just love the emphasis. Like, it's repeating it, repeating it, repeating it. And she answered, it is well.
To Gehazi.
To Gehazi. So, kind of two different responses. Right? So to Gehazi, she says, it is well. And so there's two ways you can read this as well. It could be that she's lying to him, in which case she has lied to both Gehazi and to her husband. And poor Horatio Spafford just totally misread this text and probably shouldn't have written that song. Or she is speaking truthfully, and it is well, but she is also grieving. Right? I think that it's probably that one. Right? I think that this is how we respond to death. To where we can be grieving and we can be immensely sorrowful, but we can also say, it is well with my soul. Right? To where I think that her faith it's pushing her to believe in something that has not yet happened, but her emotions are responding to the things that she's experiencing. Right? And so, like, she's responding to the things that she sees, but she's believing in the things that she has not seen yet. Right? This is what it means to live by faith. Right? She's not happy, but she's joyful. Right? It is well. Like, yes, it is well with my soul, but I'm not having the best day. Right? That's kind of what's going on. So she says, it is well. Then she came to the man of God to the hill and took hold of his feet. So she walks up, she grabs his foot and holds it in her hand. That's not what's happening. What is actually happening here? When it says took hold of his feet, what does that mean?
Like going prostrate?
Yeah, she falls down to the ground and is like, it's not that she's like has some weird foot fetish and she's like, give me that foot. Not what's happening. She falls down to the ground and she's like, you can imagine like this sorrowful woman just like wrapping herself around him, like begging. This is why he can tell, he says it as well. Things seem to be more complicated than simply those three words.
I see another parallel, like Moses being the man of God. Like, this guy's like the man of God. And so, like, in her mind, maybe what matters is the rock, hitting the rock, the staff. Mm. And so people are confusing the symbol of, like, God's power with, like, actually faith in God.
Yeah. Well, and that's going to be interesting, too, because I think we're going to have something, like, it's weird. Y'all are just, like, picking up on all these exact parallels. Because I think that is something that somebody could easily stumble into, but we're going to see that she actually doesn't stumble into that error in a second, which is pretty cool, right? So she answered, it is well. She comes to the man of God, to the hill, took hold of his feet. So she goes to the hill, right? So she is metaphorically ascending, right, to him, right? She's no longer content with just talking to the priest. She wants to talk to the man upstairs, right? She goes to him, took hold of his feet. And Gehazi came near to push her away. To me, this sounds similar to the story of the little children coming to Jesus, and the disciples try to push him away. And you remember what Jesus says? He says, yeah, let the children come to me. Right? No, if they want to be here, let them come. And so, the man of God says, let her alone, for her soul is bitter within her. He's like, Gehazi, read the room, dude. She's despairing, obviously. Like, she's having a tough day. Like, chill. Like, Gehazi's like, hey, you can't touch the man of God like that. And Elisha's like, it's okay. Something's wrong. And this part is so interesting. Let her alone, her soul has been within her, and Yahweh has hidden it from me and has not told me. What's interesting about that?
Usually, Elisha knows what's going on because he has such a close connection with God that he's sort of aware of what's already going on. But in this instance, he hasn't been told anything. So
yeah, no, that's exactly what it is. It's like he's like it's almost like Elisha himself is surprised, because it's like he's like I usually know what God's got planned, but for some reason God has hidden this even from me. Which is there's interesting just stuff to think about there. For the sake of time, we're not going to linger on it too much because it's already 8:50. We've been making pretty good time, I think. But
considering we're still going verse by verse, which will
yeah. But the implications of this are just very interesting because of, like, it makes you ask, why did God hide it from him? And I think that probably the most basic answer is that while Elisha is a prophet, he is still a man. And there are certain things that God needed to hide from him. Once again, I think it goes back to God being a God of surprises. He didn't want the woman to be prepared for this moment, right? Because I think this whole moment is about seeing where the woman is at, right? And if Elisha had known this would happen, I don't think he would have been able to hide that, right? He would have been like, God's going to give you a son. Don't be surprised if something happens to him. Just like, I think this is one of those things where Elisha himself needed to be ignorant of this in order for God to accomplish his goals. But even here, I think it's also Elisha himself being challenged to live by faith, to where Elisha doesn't fully know what's going on or how to respond to it. So we're getting to see also how a prophet, just rolling with it, knows how to trust in God.
That's how Elijah was too, right? Didn't he kind of ask God a lot, why he was doing?
Yeah, Elijah is often inquiring of God. If that's what you're talking about.
Yeah, I want to say that we talked about just where there were a lot of things where God told him to go here, to go there, but he didn't explain why.
Oh yes, yeah. So he's living by faith from moment to moment. It's like, hey, go here and I'll show you what to do. And it's almost like Elisha here, he has received no direction from God, and it's almost like we're just getting to see how well he knows God's character, right? To where in the moment it's like, okay, Elisha, here's the scenario that you're being dropped into. It's a very extreme scenario, and in many ways it makes God look like a jerk. Because God gave this woman hope and just snatched it away. How are you as a prophet going to respond? Right? So I think that there's just some really cool implications to it because it's just the perfect scenario to reveal so much about the woman and the prophet and all this stuff. But then you also go to Amos chapter 3, which I've been in Amos for the last several months. It's been amazing. It says this: surely Lord Yahweh does nothing unless he reveals his secret counsel to his slaves, the prophets. So Amos himself says, God doesn't do anything without telling the prophets first. And Amos is writing around the same time as Elisha. I mean, Amos is a little bit later, but not a whole lot later. It's maybe less than 100 years. And so Elisha kind of has the same process. He's like, I usually know exactly what God's going to do, but I didn't know about this. And so now Elisha is in uncharted territories as well. He's like, I've never been here before. Which, honestly, I'm not going to lie, I'm kind of envious. Do you know, for me, I'm more often surprised when God does speak to me. And, I'm like, oh, wow, I know what God's doing right now. That's usually, most of the time, I do not know what God is doing. I'm just like, oh, I'll figure it out one day, maybe. Whereas, I don't know, being a prophet is a huge burden, but it must have been kind of nice. Where you're like, wow. When you're more surprised when God doesn't tell you what's going on, it's like, wow, that must be nice. It's cool. Let her alone, for her soul is bitter within her, and Yahweh has hidden it from me and has not told me. So he's like, I genuinely have no idea why this woman is responding this way. And then she says, did I ask for a son from my Lord? Did I not say, do not deceive me? So there's really two things she's getting at there. What's the first thing? Did I ask for a son from my Lord?
She wants to have a child.
No.
What was that?
I said the answer is she didn't ask for a son.
Yeah, she didn't. Right? She's like, I didn't. From her perspective, if she had asked for it, maybe she could wrap her mind around this. Right? It's like, if I had asked for it, then maybe this is my punishment for being selfish. Right? Maybe I shouldn't have asked for anything. Right? Maybe I was being conceited whenever I asked for something like that, and I'm being punished for it. But I didn't ask. Right? You freely gave. Right? I said I didn't need anything. I said I'm content to live with the people. I was fine. You chose to give me this gift. So that's one thing. And then, secondly, did I not say do not deceive me? Okay, so the answer to that one is what? Did she say that?
Nope.
Well, she did say that, right? She said, don't lie to me.
I think she's rather angry about this.
Yeah, she's like, so she's like, I'm kind of frustrated here because I'm confused. Because on one hand, I did not ask for this, but then you offered it. And when you offered it, I said, don't joke around with me, right? Don't get my hopes up.
No, my Lord, O man of God, do not lie to your servant.
Yeah, so she's like, that's what I said. I told you, don't lie to me. Like, and the implication is not simply lying about giving birth to a child. It's the hope that that child carried, right? And she's like, I didn't ask for this. You gave it to me. And I told you, like, don't joke around with me. Don't deceive me. But you gave this to me anyways. And so either you were being a jerk by giving this, or you were being a liar. And the implication is that neither of those things line up with her view of God. Because God is a God of goodness, and God is a God of truth. Right? So he's not a jerk. He's not a liar. And so she's like, so I came here because I'm fully expecting you to come back with me and do something cool. Because this, like, so I think that, like, while it does sound harsh, I think it's supposed to be harsh because she's standing on the promises of God. She says, you gave this freely, which is in line with God's character. And you said you weren't lying. All right. Well, it's time to live up to that. Right? So it's intense, but I think this is this is what it means when the Bible says, boldly approach the throne of grace. Right? Like, this is a woman who is so confident in her faith, she's like, all right, God, let's talk. Not in an accusatory way, just saying, I know who you are, so show me. All right, 29 to 31.
Then he said to Gehazi, gird up your loins and take my staff in your hand, and go. If you meet anyone, do not greet him, and if anyone greets you, do not answer him, and lay my staff on the boy's face. But the mother of the boy said, as Yahweh lives and as your soul lives, I will not forsake you. And he arose and followed her. Now Gehazi passed on before them and laid the staff on the boy's face, but there was no sound or response. So he returned to meet him and told him, saying, the boy has not awakened.
All right.
She uses the Elisha line on Elisha.
Oh, yes. Right? Isn't that good? Yeah, like Elisha said to Elijah, I will not leave you or forsake you, as Yahweh lives. Right? Oh, and as you, your soul lives. Okay. I love this chapter. It's so good. Then he said to Gehazi, gird up your loins and take my staff. So what does gird up your loins mean?
Pull up your big straps, essentially.
Yeah. So back then, everybody's wearing skirts, right? Girding up your loins is basically like you take the stuff, you hike your skirt up, you tuck it between your legs, you tuck it into your belt. Basically, get ready to run, right? So he's telling him to move quickly, right? Gird up your loins and take my staff in your hand and go. So he's telling Gehazi, go ahead of me. I want you to perform this miracle. So this is Elisha kind of trying to figure out exactly what he needs to do. All right, Gehazi, you're going to go handle the situation for me. I'm just going to send you. You bring the staff. You go do it. If you meet anyone, do not greet him. If anyone greets you, do not answer him. Now, is he just telling him to be a jerk?
No, he's telling him to be quick.
He's saying you need to be a man on a mission. Right? So he's not saying to just be like, somebody says hi, just like flick him off. No, that's not what he's saying. He's saying, don't look left or right. Right? You're a man on a mission. We need to take care of this. Right? This woman's child has died. We're going to fix it. Here's my staff. You're going to go. You're going to take care of it. Lay my staff on the boy's face. That's kind of weird, but I mean, we don't need to linger on the weirdness of it. But this is what I was saying when, George, you were bringing up the staff thing. The woman is not going to fall into this, right? So we know throughout Scripture that, the staff of the prophet represents like the power of the prophet, right? Like if you go back to the Exodus, you got, Rocky loves this, the staff of Moses and Aaron and stuff, right? Really cool. But notice, so Gehazi's going to do this. But notice what the mother of the boy says. As Yahweh lives and as your soul lives, I will not forsake you. Who's she talking to?
He's like, what?
Who?
Yeah, who's she talking to?
Elisha.
Elisha. So, I love this woman's response. She says, okay, Gehazi can do what he wants, but Elisha, I'm sticking with you. And so, I'm going to go back to the house, and you're going to come with me. Because her trust is not in a staff, right? Her trust is in the man of God. And if you're going with the imagery of the whole temple thing, Elisha is the proto-incarnation, right? Like where Elisha goes, Yahweh goes. She's not simply trusting in this wooden staff. She's trusting in God, right? She says, you're the one with the power because God is working through him, right? Not some staff, right? So she says, okay, you can send the staff, But she doesn't seem to believe that the staff is going to work. She says, no, I'm not forsaking you, right? And she's pulling Elisha's line to Elijah. As Yahweh lives and as your soul lives, right? Yahweh's going to live forever. And Elisha, he's not going to live forever like Elijah, but he's going to be living for beyond this chapter. That's all that matters to him, right? And so he arose and followed her. And it seems like Elisha is beginning to pick up on this too, right? Like he's figuring out as he goes. And he's like, okay, all right. He gets up. He follows after her. Now Gehazi passed on before them, and he laid the staff in the boy's face. He gets back to Shunem. He does it, but there was no sound or response. So he returned to meet him and told him, saying, the boy has not awakened. Why do you think that is?
Only thing I'm thinking of is Gehazi. Gehazi doesn't really have any power to make the boy get
That's because
well.
the power really
Yeah.
does lie with Elisha. It doesn't lie in his staff.
So there's different ways you can go with this. On one hand, I think it could just be the whole idea that it's emphasizing the person, not the totem thing. You know, it's like, it's not the staff, it's the person. But I also think this could be one of the first things that's hitting us at us that something is wrong with Gehazi, right? Because to me, this is very similar to another story we read about in the Gospels, where if you remember, Jesus comes down from the mountain of transfiguration, and there's this demon-possessed boy that the disciples have been trying to free a demon from, but they've been failing. And then Jesus just shows up and just like casts it out, and the disciples are like, well, why couldn't we do that? And he says, this is the type of demon that can only be cast out by faith, or like through prayer. And so the implication is that there are certain miracles that can only happen if you have enough faith. And this could be hinting at the fact that Gehazi is not fully there, right? Or it could be both, really, right? It could be that Gehazi is falling short, but also that's because Elijah is the one who's actually following God, right? And so if Gehazi was actually following God, the power would be carried with him too. But Elisha is the one wearing the mantle of Elijah, right? And so ultimately it's going to be through him.
It's kind of like Gehazi sort of trusted in the power of the staff and didn't trust in the power of God.
Yeah, well, right now the woman is responding better than Gehazi. To be fair, Gehazi's just doing what Elisha told him to do. But the woman is like, I'm not leaving you, right? Like the woman seems to have known that's not going to work, right? I need you there.
But that would like reveal, like, if that was a test of her faith, then him being separate from them, it's kind of like him being separate from the room with the woman and the oil. It's like,
Oh, that's true.
that he's not tampering with it. It's like, it kind of proves her faith being with Elisha.
That's true.
If he goes ahead and it doesn't work.
Yeah, that's a valid point. All right, let's read on.
Then Elisha came into the house, and behold, the boy was dead and laid on his bed. So he entered and shut the door behind them both, and prayed to Yahweh. And he went up and lay on the child, and put his mouth on his mouth, and his eyes on his eyes, and his hands on his hands. And he stretched himself on him. And the flesh of the child became warm. Then he returned and walked in the house once back and forth, and went up and stretched himself on him. And the boy sneezed 7 times, and the boy opened his eyes. Then he called Gehazi and said, Call the Shunammite. So he called her. Then she came in to him, and he said, Take up your son. Then she came in and fell at his feet, and bowed herself to the ground. And she took up her son and went out.
All right, I'm back. Back to life. All right, let's just walk through it. Then Elisha came into the house, and behold, the boy was dead and laid on his bed. Whose bed? Elisha's bed, right? So Elisha's like, what the heck? This is my bed. But keep in mind, if you're going to what Sean kind of pointed out, the bed is metaphorically the altar, right? So you have metaphorical God ascending to his metaphorical temple, and he finds the only child of this woman laid on the metaphorical altar, just like Isaac bound on the altar of like on Mount Moriah. Were you gonna say something, Rocky?
I didn't even make that connection, but now I think about it,
It's cool, right?
in my mind.
Yeah. So Elisha came into the house, and behold, the boy was dead and laid on his bed. So he entered And he shut the door behind them both, and he prayed to Yahweh. Why is it important that it just specifies that he prayed to Yahweh?
Because he gets his power from God.
Yeah, it's just clarifying, while he is this portable temple tabernacle thing, he is not Yahweh, right? So he's a foreshadowing of Jesus. He ain't Jesus, right? Because Jesus, remember, Jesus will pray to God before some of his miracles, but usually he'll specify, hey, God, I'm praying to you, but it's not because I need to do this to perform the miracle. He says, I'm doing this so that everybody around me knows that you're the one working through me. But Jesus can also wake up from a nap and tell a storm to shut up, and the storm will listen, right? So it just specifies that, yes, Elisha is like a temple, and he is like an incarnation of Yahweh, but he is not himself. Like the power doesn't come from Elisha. The power comes from God. Yeah.
I was going to mention, you said how Elijah's like a tabernacle.
Mm-hmm.
Well, in verse 33 it says he entered and shut the door behind them both and prayed to Yahweh. So he's kind of like a priest. He goes into the special...
Yeah, the Holy of Holies
door,
metaphorically. Yeah.
in all the protected gear and touches the... what is it called? The Ark of the Covenant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, and so they're metaphorically inside the temple right now, right? It's just kind of cool.
And so also Jesus casts out the demons with like force. He like commands them out.
Yes.
And here he's like, even though he's foreshadowing Jesus, he has to like beg, like, please God, like let them live, like let this miracle happen.
Yeah, he's submitting to God, right? And then this is kind of weird, but it's very similar to what Elijah did whenever Elijah resurrected the boy. And he went up and he lay on the child, and he put his mouth on his mouth, and his eyes on his eyes, and his hands on his hands. So he's like, also keep in mind, this is disgusting. Not only is this child dead, but they've had a long journey in between. So this child is decaying, right? From a Jewish perspective, I mean, you are becoming the definition of unclean. But that's not how the story's going to end, right? Like, this is what I'm saying. Life being given to death. Sorry. Life being given to death. We also have cleanness being given to uncleanness, right? So rather than this child having to go through the waters and being bathed, we literally have cleanness being transferred into the unclean. Whereas normally, if a clean person touches an unclean thing, they become unclean.
Is that another parallel of Jesus where he doesn't? It goes the other way. He
Exactly.
doesn't clean.
That's what I'm saying. It's a reversal.
Clean.
Yeah, like this is the redemptive power of God, right? It's pretty cool, right? So, like normally, whenever a good person comes in contact with an evil person, the good person becomes evil. Jesus shows up and he makes evil people good, right? So what we see here is God's redemptive power. So he goes, he lays on the child, mouth to mouth, eye to eye, hand to hand, like just like very weird posture. But the idea, like the imagery, it's almost like him being transferred over, right? It's like his mouth is breathing into this guy's mouth. His eyes are here. His hands are there. Like, it's almost like his life is being laid down. Like if you're going with the altar imagery, right? It's literally like you've got a child laying on the altar and then God himself going on the altar. And he is giving his life metaphorically for the child so that the child may live. And they both live, kind of like Jesus does for us, right? Jesus goes on the cross we deserve so that we all can be resurrected to new life, right? Like the imagery is just really cool.
Would there also be like, sorry to interrupt.
That's fine.
Like, in this imagery, would it also be like, from God's perspective, like Elisha is like covering, kind of
like the Ark of the Covenant?
Kind of like, yeah.
Like the mercy seat thing?
I think so, yeah. I guess what I was thinking of was like Jesus like blood covering us, and it's like he sees like Jesus, his like righteousness.
But hovers
like,
covers
us.
His spirit?
Well, yeah. So like,
but it's like from like God's point of view, like
from heaven looking down, he doesn't see the dead child. He sees the man of God, like covering him almost.
Just so this specifies like this, like it's corresponding. It's like he's like exactly covering him.
Yeah.
So from like God's point of view, it's like.
Dude, how dope would it be if the kid's arms are outstretched and they're literally in the shape of a cross right now?
And again, maybe I'm reading into it, but like even like the mouth-to-mouth thing, it's like the idea of like God breathing life.
I was going to bring that up in a second, so yes.
Okay.
No, I think that this also calls back to the Garden of Eden. Because remember, all the temple imagery calls back to the Garden of Eden because the Garden of Eden was God's original temple. And How did he produce life? He breathed life into the nostrils, right? And that's how Adam was born. Well, we read this. He stretched himself on him, and the flesh of the child became warm, right? Then he returned and walked into the house once, back and forth. So the child isn't fully alive yet, but he's beginning to come alive. And went up, and he stretched himself on him, and the boy sneezed 7 times, and the boy opened his eyes. The 7 times thing is kind of weird. I'm assuming the number 7 is, perfection, right? But also calling back to Genesis, right? 7 days of creation, God creates Adam, breathes life into him through the nostrils, right? This kid is sneezing, right? And then there's life. So Elisha is once again functioning like God, right? He is giving life to what was nothing but decaying dirt, right? That's what, that's what you are whenever you're dead, right? You're just decaying dirt. And Elisha breathes life into him. This is kind of weird that it's like a gradual miracle rather than like an immediate one. So like he lays on him one time, and then like he begins to come alive, and then he does it a second time, and then the child like fully resuscitates. It brings back to mind a story that we have in the Gospels when Jesus like heals a blind man, and at first the guy says like, I see people walking around and they look like trees. And then Jesus like does some more stuff, and then the guy's fully healed. I don't really know why like God does that sometimes. He just does things differently, right? Sometimes it's immediate, sometimes it's gone. You're leaving?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bye.
I'll see you then.
Get some
Sorry
good
about
sleep.
that.
Alright. Then he called Gehazi and he said, call this Shunammite. So he called her. And then she came in and he said, take up your son. Such a good moment, right? She's just, I don't know. Like, this is the reward of her faith, right? And also, to me, this does call back, once again, Genesis 22. Take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, right? But this is the end of the story. Take up your son, right? He ain't dead no more. Why do you search for the living amongst the dead? You came in here, behold, he has risen, just as I said. Then she came in and fell at his feet and bowed herself to the ground. Hey, she fell at his feet again. But the imagery is totally different now, isn't it? Right? Why is she falling at his feet now? Gratitude. She fell at his feet, bowed herself to the ground, and she took up her son and went out. Right? So, if you're following with the story, we've got a widow and orphans who are near the point of death after the husband dies, and God produces life from death. We've got the Shunammite, whose womb is barren, and God produces life from death. And then the child dies, and God produces life from death. Right? They're living in a culture of death. God intervenes and produces life. All right, we move on. We are almost done. There are 44 verses. We're getting there.
Now Elisha returned to Gilgal, and there was a famine in the land. As the sons of the prophets were sitting before him, he said to his young man, put on the large pot and boil stew for the sons of the prophets. Then one went out into the field to gather herbs, and found a wild vine, and gathered from it wild gourds, filling his cloak, and came and sliced them into the pot of stew, for they did not know what they were. So they poured it out for the men to eat. And it happened that as they were eating of the stew, they cried out and said, O man of God, there is death in the pot. And they were unable to eat. But he said, now bring flour. He threw it into the pot and said, pour it out for the people that they may eat. Then there was no more harm in the pot.
There you go. This is probably one of the most explicit places where it's death, because it sounds kind of weird. There is death in the pot. It's like,
Bummer.
all right. What's that?
Bummer.
Bummer. Womp, womp. All right. So this is what, miracle number 4? Well, really, I guess there's been more than that. I don't know. Like,
Another one with
it's hard to keep track of at this point.
Another one with food.
Yep, another one with food. Now, Elisha returned to Gilgal. Remind me what Gilgal is.
Birthplace of the giants.
No, that's Gath.
Is that Samuel?
Close.
That's right.
What about it?
Saul.
Is that
No, that's Gibeah.
Okay.
So Gilgal was associated with Saul, but Gibeah was like with it. Gilgal was the capital under Saul.
Okay.
Yeah. And remember, that's the first place where they camped
It
at.
was Philistine.
Yes. Well, no, it wasn't Philistine territory, but it was the first place where they camped at whenever they crossed the Jordan River. Right. Well, yeah.
Like when they were about to attack Jericho.
Yeah. Even though, once again, we talked about this before, this could be a different Gilgal, because we talked about this whenever Elijah was getting ready to leave to heaven. Remember, they went to Gilgal and that kind of stuff.
That Gilgal is in Judah.
Judah, yeah. I think it's on the border, so that's why it's it'd be kind of weird. Most likely this is a different Gilgal, but it never specifies, and so, and it's hard to determine whether or not there was another Gilgal. So, but the name was pretty common just because it means circle of stones, and so they'd make monuments.
Perhaps he literally did just go from
What's that place where the stones are in a circle?
Shunem and Mount Carmel.
Stonehenge, yeah.
Perhaps he did go from Shunem and Mount Carmel, which it's hard to pinpoint for me because I don't know the exact locations, but I know it's in the Israelite kingdom.
Yeah.
Somewhere, and then he just went down to Judah.
Yeah, that's possible. So Elisha returned to Gilgal, and there was a famine in the land. Time out. If there's a famine in the land, what does that imply? People are not being faithful, right? That's important to know because it helps you interpret the rest of the story, right? Because it lets you know that all these stories are happening when in general people are being unfaithful, right? So all the good things God is doing are for people who don't deserve it. Yes, there are exceptions, right? The Shunammite woman, and then so we've seen good, faithful people, but by and large, the people have turned away from God, right? But that doesn't mean God's going to abandon His promises. It just means that God's going to do things a little bit differently, right? That make sense? All right. So there's a famine in the land, and as the sons of the prophets were sitting before him, he said to his young man, Gehazi again, put on the large pot and boil stew for the sons of the prophets. All right, what did he tell them to do?
Go make food.
Hey, let's feed these guys. We need some food. Then one went out into the field to gather herbs and found a wild vine, gathered from it wild gourds, filling his cloak, and came and sliced them into the pot for stew, for they did not know what they were. Yes, sir.
Okay, this is kind of off topic.
Okay.
But it kind of reminds me of the tree of good and evil. Kind of.
Okay.
You eat the apple, you become death, kind of. You know what I'm trying to...
I can kind of see, yeah. I can see that a little bit. Okay, so what happens here?
They're basically just gathering all the stuff they need for the...
Yeah.
Well, another thing that this is it's a famine, and yet they're cooking a whole bunch.
Yeah. Well, so there's a famine, but that also means that they just kind of have to grab whatever they can.
Yeah.
And so the dude goes out and just grabs stuff, but he doesn't even know what half of it is, right? He's just we don't have a lot of options, and we got a lot of people to feed, so it's just he's just filling it up.
It's
right?
essentially an ancient version of the first Caesar salad.
Sure.
You've never heard the story of
I've never heard the story of
Okay,
Caesar
I'll
salads.
share it quickly. Basically, there was this bar in Tijuana, Mexico, that on the 4th of July was running out of stuff because they were getting absolutely hammered. And so this guy, Caesar Gherardini, he basically says, okay, gather up all the freaking ingredients you can in the kitchen, and I'm going to make it appear fancy by preparing it at people's, tableside. And
Okay.
that was what ended up being Caesar salad.
That's funny.
And it was named after Gherardini.
Were you the one who posted the meme about Caesar salads?
Maybe.
Where it's where Caesar, it's he's getting stabbed, and they're like, any last words or any last requests? And he's like, name a salad after me. Either you're the one who posted it, or I saw it, and I was like, Sean would like this joke. Or maybe I sent it to you. I have no idea.
No, it's
Probably
people's first assumptions are always, the salad must have originated in freaking Italy or something because it uses a lot of Italian ingredients.
Yeah, that's funny.
And with
Tijuana?
Caesar, and I'm like, it was the actual story for Caesar salad is even better than that.
Yeah. So, for those of y'all who are watching online, now you know that story. Okay. So yeah, one went out to the field, gathered herbs, found a wild vine, gathered it from the wild gourds, filling up his cloak, and came and sliced them into the pot for stew, but they did not know what they were. So he just goes out, and he's just stuffing his cloak. He's like, all right, well, there's some stuff. And it's this is cool. And they come, they throw it all together, which I just got to tell you, not a good idea, right? But hey, Elisha didn't tell him to know what he was doing. He just said, let's feed him. And he's like, okay, I'm not a cook, but sure.
Just grabbing anything out of the field.
Yeah.
Pick up.
Apparently they grabbed something bad.
What's that?
They said apparently they grabbed something bad.
Oh, yeah. So they poured it out for the men to eat. And it happened that as they were eating of the stew, they cried out and said, "O man of God, there is death in the pot." And they were unable to eat.
They grabbed one of them poison mushrooms.
Yeah, they accidentally ate a little bit too much Taco Bell. And they're like, oh, like, I don't know. Like, I don't know what it is, but like, either the smell of it or somebody ate it and they like immediately were like, there is something severely wrong. Yeah, so they're like vomiting and they're like, this is not good. And then the poor guy who gathered this stuff's like, man, I don't know who gathered that. Idiot. But apparently, dude was not a good cook, did not know what he was doing, and basically this concoction is going to kill them if they don't do something about it. Right? They're like, no, this stuff is death. It's gross. And this is where you get to see the theme that the author is trying to emphasize. Because typically, this is not how you usually speak about food. There's death in the pot. No, the author is trying to emphasize Elisha is a guy who steps into death and produces life. Right?
This is almost like Jesus like saying a parable, and they're like, we don't get it. And he's like, you're gonna die.
Yeah, exactly.
It's like I'm speaking plainly.
Yeah, let me speak plainly to you. They are saying that there's death in the pot. Right? In reality, were they dying from it? No, they're probably just saying this food sucks and it's bad and we're going to get sick. Right? I mean, I doubt that people were actually dying from this because that means that they've been, like, they waited a really long time unless they just, like, fell over dead immediately. But no, they're like, we're getting sick from this. This is gross and bad. But who do they go to? The man of God. And I like that he's not being called by his name as much anymore. It's always man of God. Man of God. Like, it's almost like God man. Right? Like, hey, God man, solve the problem. God man, solve the problem. God man, solve the problem. The emphasis is not on who he is, because the glory does not go to Elisha. The glory goes to the God working through the man. What were you going to say?
No, I'm just saying, the glory is being brought to God.
Yeah. So they were unable to eat, right? They're like, we are not touching this crap. It is bad. But he said, now bring the flour. Okay, now, do you really think that all it needed was flour? Right? I mean, this is like, Elisha just walked up and he looked at it and he's like Gordon Ramsay being like, this is trash. Well, what's that?
He's like, I'm going to turn this to gumbo.
Yeah. Like, throw some flour in there. Like, do you think that all it was needing was an ingredient? No. Right? This is going to be a miracle that is occurring. Right? Flour does not magically turn ill-making food into like delicious stuff. Right? So there's a miracle happening here. Bring the flour. He threw it into the pot and said, pour it out for the people that they may eat. And there was no harm in the pot. Right? So miraculously, this food is produced, like, it's made better. Right? And they can actually eat it. And now, God is providing for the sons of the prophets in the midst of famine. Because once again, even before there was death in the pot, there was already death in the land. Because it's famine, right? Literally, the land itself is dying.
It's sick.
Yes, the land itself is sick. And God steps in, and he is turning it into a land flowing with milk and honey once again. There are some people who have like spiritualized this, and they've used it to, like, for like a metaphor. And they say how whenever the people of God they pull from every which source to produce the food that they feed to the congregations, all they're producing is death. And what we need the pure flour of the Word of God to produce life. And that might be a bit of a stretch, but I mean, it's still true. Is that what this passage is about? Not quite, but
I wasn't reading something else. I was reading it as the flour is definitely a miracle. You're supposed to read this and think God heals them through the flour. But then I was wondering about how people reinterpret the parting of the seas, not as a literal God parts the waters, they walk through dry land, but as like, no, every so often the weather changes and then there's land again. Yeah. And they would do the same kind of here and say, oh, well, those ingredients were bad, but there's also ingredients that are good, and they were just mixing ingredients, and have a naturalistic explanation rather than a miraculous one.
Well, yeah, but that always goes to, like, that comes from a secular point of view where people are trying
But they had that in seminary.
disprove.
So, yeah. And to be fair, there are times where God can use naturalistic means to accomplish supernatural goals. Right? So not every miracle God does is going to be clearly supernatural.
Like how we were talking last week about how
The water.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like, there's times where it's like so God can say, hey, water's going to show up. And he could send a storm that sends water downstream. Or like sometimes it's less about the actual action and more about the timing. So whenever Elisha says fire's going to come down from heaven, he's probably talking about lightning, right? Is lightning inherently miraculous? No. But if I say lightning's going to strike this microphone in 3, 2, 1, boom, and then it happens, okay, that's a miracle, right? It's like, so the context is what shapes it. God can use like natural things, right? I mean, when he like Noah's flood, it just rained, right? It's still an act of God, right? Whenever God sends the Assyrians to destroy Israel, I mean, that's natural, right? It's just one nation waging war against another, but he's working behind the scenes, right? And so that's something we have to be aware of. But in this instance, it does seem to be actually miraculous. And like our typical definition of the term, where it's like actually a supernatural thing. Okay, final verses. Let's cover it. Here's the feeding of the 5,000 thing, kind of.
Now a man came from Baal Shalisha and brought the man of God bread for the first fruits, 20 loaves of barley and fresh ears of grain in his sack. And he said, give them to the people that they may eat. And his attendant said, what, will I give this before 100 men? But he said, give them to the people that they may eat, for thus says Yahweh, they shall eat and have some left over. So he gave it before them, and they ate and had some left over, according to the word of Yahweh.
There we go. Sound familiar? It's like the feeding of the 5,000. Right? 5 loaves and 2 fish, feeding 5,000 plus, except this is that to a smaller scale. Because when Jesus shows up, he's just a boss. All right, we can cover this pretty quick because we've gone quite a bit over. But hey, I think we started late and we had a lot to cover, and it was a fun chapter. So now a man came from Baal Shalisha. If you're wondering what that means, it means Baal, Baal, or like Baal means Lord, right? And Shalisha means 3, so it's literally like Lord of 3 things.
Oh.
I figured that since it mentioned that, there might be significance to it, but like...
It's probably just the name of the town.
Yeah, it's just the name of the town. Like, I just always think it's so funny whenever like it goes out of its way, like the things that the authors choose to highlight, because like you can have this entire story about the Shunammite woman, you never learn her name, or her husband's name, right? But then it'll be like, this man came from Baal Shalisha, and you're like, alright, did we need to know where he came from? Like, yeah, it's like, couldn't you have just said the man came by? Like, that's just what's interesting to me. It's like, you chose to, like, the details you chose to share, like, it seems like just telling us the Shunammite woman's name would be easier than saying, the Shunammite woman. But, like, just, I don't know, was her name just, like, Tracy? Like, that's easier.
Maybe it's trying to show which areas Elisha affected.
They want to affect.
Yeah, it's just probably, like, the scope.
The scope.
Right.
Yeah. What were you going to say?
No, I just had a question. They didn't do it on purpose, but who knows?
Yeah. So a man came from Baal Shalisha, and he brought the man of God bread of the first fruits, 20 loaves of barley, and fresh ears of grain in his sack. So right here, once again, you see Elisha functioning almost like a temple. Because this is an offering, right? Like, this is literally a man showing up, and he is giving an offering or a sacrifice to Elisha, right? He has got 20 loaves of barley and fresh ears of grain, right? This is like, it's a free will offering or like a grain offering that you read about in Leviticus. He's like, hey, I brought this for you.
I just read that.
Yeah, well, there you go. And he said, give them to the people that they may eat. So rather than taking the food for himself, what does Elisha say to do? Just give it to others, right? Let's give it to other people. This calls back or calls forward to the feeding of the 5,000. If you remember, I love the feeding of the 5,000 story because it takes place right after Jesus learned about the death of John the Baptist. So he has a lot on his mind, right? He's thinking about his cousin just died. He's thinking about his own impending death. And then his disciples just got back from the 2x2 mission that he sent them out on. So they're exhausted. And Jesus says, let's withdraw to a desolate place and just be alone together, right? If anybody deserves a vacation, it's these guys. They go there, and there's 5,000 people plus women and children who bombard them. And in that moment, Jesus and them, I think, would be entitled to say, hey, go home, right? If I if I preached at church on Wednesday night and then I came home and the entire congregation was lined outside my door, I'd be like, guys, please leave. But that's not what Jesus does. Jesus says, let's take care of them. And he spends the whole day healing them. Evening starts arriving, and the disciples say, Jesus, these people are hungry. Let's just get them to leave. And Jesus says, no, let's feed them. And they're like, well, we don't have any food. We don't even have enough money to feed them. And he's like, well, what do we have? 5 loaves and 2 fish. He says, that'll do. And then he feeds probably 15 to 20,000 people with that, right? So you see a lot of the parallels here, right? This sacrifice, this offering is given to Elisha, yet rather than serving himself, he chooses to serve others, right? So he says, give them to the people that they may eat, right? He is trying to feed the people, right? Because, keep in mind, they're in the midst of a famine, right? So, first off, this dude from Baal Shah, he is, this isn't really, it's a sacrifice, right? He has got grain, which he could have kept for himself, yet he gives it to Elisha, right? He's saying, this is my gift to you. That's a sign of respect. But then Elisha says, I want to take this and give it to the people, because they're the ones who need it. And so his attendant said, what shall I give this before 100 men? He's like, this is a good amount of grain in a famine, but there's 100 people out there, Elisha. How are we going to feed all of them? But he said, give them to the people that they may eat. For thus says Yahweh, they shall eat and have some left over. So he gave it before them, and they ate and had some left over, according to the word of Yahweh. What God says, he shall surely do. Right? So, you can see how this is expanded with Jesus, right? So here you've got, 20 loaves of barley and fresh ears of grain, right? 20 loaves of barley, I'm assuming these are pretty sizable loaves. If you broke those in 2, that'd probably be good for each guy, right? So that's 40 people fed just with what's there, but they managed to feed 100, right? So there is still this multiplication that happens here. Jesus, meanwhile, takes 5 loaves and 2 fish, right? That's like a lunchbox. And he feeds 15 to 20,000 people. So he is Elisha 2.0, or really he's like Elisha 2000, right? He's like Elisha to the extreme. But through all of this, once again, God is entering into a story of death, and he is producing life. That's really the main theme for all of this. Real quick, before we wrap up, let me just check to see if there's anything else I wanted to read from here, because I'm sure there was. No, I don't need to read that. I always put stars next to the thing I want to read. All right. Let's see. All right. Like Sarah, the woman represents unfruitful Israel, who cannot bear seed, being as good as dead. When 2 Kings chapter 4 is compared to Genesis 18, it is clear that Elisha stands in the narrative location of the angel of Yahweh, because he is the angel messenger of Yahweh. When the boy dies, Elisha sends his servant, but like Jesus' disciples, Gehazi is unable to perform the necessary miracle, and his lack of success is described in the same terms as the failure of Baal in 1 Kings 18. So that's going back to Carmel. The prophet's staff is not sufficient. Only when Elisha himself, the prophet clothed in the mantle of Elijah, lies on the boy does he come back to life. Instead of becoming unclean by his contact with the boy's body, Elisha's body communicates life to the boy's dead flesh, making his nostrils breathe and sneeze as Yahweh does to the nostrils of Adam. Similarly, only when poisonous stew is brought to Elisha does it give life, and only when loaves are brought to Elisha are they multiplied to feed many. Where Elisha is, there is life, because there is Yahweh. Yeah, so there's some other stuff he highlights there, but I think that's probably good for today. Anything y'all want to add? We didn't really talk a whole lot about application here. There is a lot of room for application, I think, mainly in regards to trusting God and being faithful and not needing to know all the answers. There's also broader stuff beyond that, but we've gone pretty long. Is there anything y'all want to add?
It's really cool they're repeating miracles. It's cool.
Yeah.
Multiplication.
And we're going to continue to see some really cool miracles.
Big.
The Elisha story is actually really exciting. There's a lot of really neat stuff that we see with them. Y'all got anything? No? Alright. Next week, we are going to be talking about Naaman or Naaman the leper. We get to see a Gentile dude who shows up, and the story's actually pretty cool too. This whole Elisha narrative is probably the most thrilling part of Kings, just altogether, other than like the stuff with Solomon probably at the beginning. And then, unfortunately, after Elisha disappears, it's going to get rough again. But that's all right. We'll go through it together, 1 week at a time. Sound good? One of y'all want to close us out in prayer? Don't make me call him Rocky again. Don't make me call on somebody. Somebody volunteer. Oh, Maverick, thank you.
Dear Yahweh, I pray to you tonight that that we have zero distractions, and that what we went through tonight, that we not only just let it marinate, but we use that as application to help live for you in any way we can, and to lean on you. And I just want to thank you for everyone in this room, and everyone who's watching. I thank you for everyone and everything. And therefore I thank you for you and you only, for everything comes from you. I say this in your name, truthfully and honestly. In your name. Amen.
Amen. Da 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 da. It's really weird.